Clara Whitfield pressed her last coin into the palm of a stranger's child and walked away with nothing. Not a cent, not a plan, just the weight of a suitcase she could barely lift, and a body that ached from 3 days of hard traveling through the Montana summer heat. She had exactly one name written on a folded piece of paper, one ranch, one chance, and every single person she had passed on the road into Willow Creek had looked at her the same way with the kind of pity that felt worse than cruelty. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people, stay with me, because this story belongs to you. Subscribe to this channel and follow every part of Clara's story until the very end. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The summer of 1889 came to Montana Territory the way trouble always came to Willow Creek, hot, dry, and without warning. The town itself wasn't much to look at. A single main street with a general store, a post office, a church that leaned slightly to the left, and a saloon that never seemed to close. Dust settled on everything. Horses tied to hitching posts switched their tails against the flies. Women in bonnets moved quickly from one errand to the next, keeping their eyes forward and their opinions close. Willow Creek was a town that knew everybody's business and judged it freely. And on the morning Clara Whitfield walked into town, the judgment started before she even reached the end of the main street. She heard it first from 2 women standing outside the dry goods store. They didn't lower their voices. People in Willow Creek rarely bothered. "Good Lord," the taller one said loud enough to carry. "Would you look at that?" The second woman pressed her lips together and shook her head slowly the way people do when they believe they're being subtle and are not. Clara didn't stop walking. She had learned a long time ago that stopping gave people the satisfaction of knowing they'd landed their blow. She kept her shoulders square, her chin level, and her eyes fixed on the road ahead, even though every part of her body was exhausted. Her feet were blistered inside her worn boots, and the suitcase in her right hand felt like it was filled with river stones. She had walked 6 miles from the edge of town where the supply wagon had dropped her off. 6 miles in the July heat. The driver had been kind enough, an older man named Silas, who hauled feed from Billings every 2 weeks. He had offered her a ride into town when he found her walking on the side of the road just before dawn, and he hadn't asked too many questions. Just handed her a tin cup of water from his canteen, and told her she had more grit than most men he knew. That had meant more to Clara than Silas would ever understand. She had needed to hear something kind. She had been traveling for 3 days on almost nothing. A biscuit shared with her the first morning. Half an apple someone left on a fence post that she told herself was probably meant for a horse but ate anyway. Water from creek crossings whenever the wagon stopped long enough. She was hungry in the deep bone-level way that goes beyond the stomach and starts to reach the mind. The kind of hunger that makes everything feel a little unreal, a little far away, like you're watching your own life through foggy glass. But she kept walking. Because at the end of this road was a name. Carter Ranch. She had read the advertisement 3 times before she believed it was real. A proper cook position. Good wages. Room and board included. She had copied down the address in her careful handwriting on the last clean page of the small notebook she carried in her coat pocket. The notebook where she kept recipes, measurements, and the occasional prayer when she had nothing left to offer but words. When she finally reached the edge of Willow Creek and turned onto the road that led north toward the valley, she let herself stop for just a moment. She set the suitcase down. She pressed both hands against the small of her back where the ache had settled deepest. She looked out at the land stretching ahead of her, golden grass and distant mountains, and a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, and she made herself a quiet promise. Whatever happened at that ranch, she would not beg. She would not apologize for arriving. She would not shrink herself to fit anyone else's idea of what she was supposed to be. She had done enough of that for one lifetime. Clara Whitfield was 30 years old, and she had been reduced, dismissed, and discarded by people who should have known better. Her late husband Harold's family had made sure of that. The moment Harold was in the ground, they had swept through everything: the house, the furniture, the small savings he had kept in a tin box under the kitchen floorboard. They had taken it all with the quiet efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment. And when Clara had stood in her own doorway and asked them what they thought they were doing, Harold's eldest brother had looked at her with a kind of flat contempt that she still felt sometimes in the middle of the night. "You were his wife," he had said, "not his heir. There's nothing here that belongs to you." She had left Kansas with one suitcase, the same suitcase she was carrying now. She picked it up again and walked the last mile to Carter Ranch. The gates were iron tall and plain, with the initials NC worked into the metal in simple letters. No flourish, no decoration. Just the name, because the name was enough. Everyone in the county knew what it meant. Clara pushed open the gate herself. The house was large, 2 stories of weathered timber, a wide front porch windows that needed washing. Behind the main house, she could see the barn, and beyond it, the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived. Horses in a paddock. Chickens somewhere nearby, she could hear them. The smell of hay and wood smoke and the particular clean smell of wide-open country that she had never encountered in Kansas quite the way it existed here. She walked up the porch steps. She knocked on the door. For a long moment, nothing. She knocked again. When the door opened, the man standing in the frame was not what she had expected. She had imagined someone older, softer maybe. The kind of widower who had gone a little gray around the edges and moved through life with the careful slowness of someone who had learned not to rush toward anything. Nathaniel Carter was none of those things. None. He was tall, lean in the way of men who spent their lives doing actual physical work rather than just directing it. Dark hair that had gone slightly too long the way a man's hair does when he has stopped paying attention to such things. A face that might have been handsome in a different expression, but was currently set in the particular hard stillness of a man who has been interrupted by something he didn't ask for. He looked at Clara. Clara looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Nathaniel said, "I wasn't expecting anyone until Thursday." "It's Thursday," Clara said. He glanced past her at the empty road as if checking for something. A wagon, maybe. A second person. Some explanation for why this woman had apparently arrived at his door alone on foot, carrying a battered suitcase in the summer heat. "You walked," he said. "I walked the last part," Clara said. "The first part I rode. Supply wagon dropped me at the North Road Junction. That's 6 miles. I'm aware of that." Something moved across his face. She couldn't read it exactly. It wasn't quite surprise, and it wasn't quite respect, and it was definitely not the quick flash of assessment and dismissal she had grown accustomed to seeing on people's faces when they looked at her for the first time. It was something more complicated than any of those things. "You walked 6 miles to apply for a cooking job," he said. Clara set her suitcase down on the porch beside her, straightened up and met his eyes directly. "I walked 6 miles because I need the position, and I intend to do it well," she said. "I've been cooking since I was 8 years old. I can stretch a side of beef into 3 days of different meals. I can bake bread without a proper oven if I have to, and I have never once served a meal that made anyone wish they'd skipped supper. If that's not what you're looking for, I'll thank you for your time and find another road to walk." Nathaniel Carter stared at her, a long, quiet stare that she held without flinching. Then he stepped back from the door and said, "Come in." She picked up her suitcase. She walked past him into the house, and the first thing she noticed was not the size of it, which was considerable, or the quality of the furniture, which was good even underneath the neglect. What she noticed first was the silence. The particular quality of silence that doesn't come from quietness, but from absence. From a place where sound used to live and doesn't anymore. The second thing she noticed was the kitchen. Nathaniel led her through the main hallway and pushed open a door at the back of the house, and Clara stepped into what had once been, she could tell, a genuinely beautiful kitchen. Large cast-iron stove, a long wooden work table scarred from years of use, windows that faced east for the morning light, a proper pantry with a heavy door, the bones of a room that someone had once loved working in, but the shelves were nearly bare. The stove was cold, and had been cold for a long time, she could tell by the way the iron had gone slightly dull. The work table had a layer of dust along one edge that nobody had bothered to wipe. The pantry, when she pulled open the door, held basic staples: flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt, but nothing that suggested anyone had recently thought about what a real meal might require. "How many men are you feeding?" Clara asked. 28 ranch hands," Nathaniel said. "Sometimes 30 when we're moving cattle." "And what have they been eating?" A pause. "Whatever Hector puts together," Nathaniel said. "He's been handling it since the last cook left." "When did the last cook leave?" Another pause, longer this time. 8 months ago," he said. Clara turned from this pantry and looked at him. He was standing in the doorway of the kitchen with his arms crossed and his expression carefully closed, the way men hold themselves when they don't want you to see that a question has gotten somewhere it wasn't supposed to reach. "What's Hector's usual?" she asked. "Salt pork, beans, cornbread when he has the energy. Every day. More or less." Clara looked at the cold stove. She looked at the bare shelves. She thought about 28 men eating salt pork and beans for 8 months because nobody had bothered to fix it, or because nobody had cared enough to notice it needed fixing. "I'm going to need supplies," she said. "You can write a list. I'll send someone to town. I'll need a full pantry within 2 days. Onions, potatoes, dried herbs. If you can get them proper cuts of meat, eggs, butter, dried fruit. Coffee that doesn't taste like it was ground 6 months ago." She was already pulling open cabinet doors, taking stock, making her list in her head, the way she always had instinctively, the way other people breathed. "I'll need to assess what's in the root cellar and what's in the smokehouse before I plan the weekly menu." Nathaniel was quiet. She glanced back at him. "Is there a problem?" she asked. "No," he said. He said it like a man who has just had something happen to him that he hasn't fully processed yet. "No problem." "Then I'd like to start this afternoon," Clara said. "I can have supper on the table by 6 if I begin now." "You just walked 6 miles, Nathaniel said. Clara looked at him steadily. "I've done harder things on less sleep," she said. "And your men have been eating salt pork for 8 months, supper by 6. She turned back to the pantry. Behind her she heard the quiet sound of him walking back through the hallway. And then she heard something she wouldn't identify until much later, when she had learned the sounds of that house well enough to read them the way you read weather. A sound like a man exhaling for the first time in a very long time. She went to work. Word traveled through the ranch the way word always traveled faster than it had any right to. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the ranch hands knew there was a new cook. By 4 o'clock, several of them had found reasons to walk past the kitchen window. By 5 o'clock, the smell coming from the main house had done something to the atmosphere of the entire property that nobody could quite explain, but everybody felt. Tommy Briggs, who was 19 years old and had been working Carter Ranch for 2 years and had eaten Hector's salt pork so many times, he had begun to believe that supper was something you simply endured rather than enjoyed, stopped dead in the middle of the yard, and lifted his face like a dog catching a scent. "Is that bread?" he said to nobody in particular. "Can't be," said old Pete Garner, who was 53 and had once eaten a boot during a hard winter in Wyoming and considered himself an authority on the topic of desperation foods. "We ain't had real bread since—" He stopped. His face changed. "Lord, that's bread." Clara had found enough in the pantry to work with. The smoked pork wasn't beyond saving if you knew what to do with it, and she did. She made a thick stew with the pork and the dried beans stretched with onions from the root cellar and seasoned with enough salt and pepper and dried thyme to make it taste like something a person had thought about rather than something a person had simply thrown together. She made cornbread in the cast-iron skillet the way her mother had taught her, with a touch of sugar and enough fat to make it come out with a golden crust that shattered when you broke it. She found dried apples in the back of a cabinet and made a simple sauce that she heated with cinnamon and a scraping of sugar and set in a pot on the back of the stove to stay warm. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. At 6 o'clock, she called the ranch hands to supper. They came in the way hungry men always come to a table, a little suspicious, a little hopeful, doing their best not to show either. They filed into the long dining room that adjoined the kitchen, a room with a table that could seat 30, and had probably once been the site of actual conversation, and they found their places and looked at what was said in front of them. Nobody spoke. Clara stood near the kitchen doorway and watched. Tommy Briggs picked up his spoon, dipped it into the stew, brought it to his mouth. His face did something complicated. His eyes went somewhere else for a moment. Somewhere private, somewhere that belonged only to him. "My mother used to make something like this," he said quietly, "back home in Tennessee, when I was small." He paused. "I hadn't thought about that in a long time," Clara said. "Then it means she gave you something worth carrying." Tommy looked up at her. He had the young man's face open and a little raw, the way young faces are, and something in it shifted. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I reckon she did." The room was quiet in the way that a room gets quiet when something real has happened in it. Old Pete cleared his throat and said gruffly, "Well, it ain't bad," which from Pete was the equivalent of writing a formal testimonial, and several other men laughed, and just like that the silence broke and turned into something else. Voices, the clink of spoons against bowls, the comfortable sound of men eating a meal they actually wanted to eat. Nathaniel Carter came to supper late. He always came to supper late, she would learn. He ate by habit rather than by appetite, standing at the kitchen counter sometimes, rather than sitting at the table eating quickly and without pleasure, the way a man eats when he has forgotten that food is meant to be anything more than fuel. But that evening he came to the dining room. He came to the table. He sat down at the head of it, which she suspected he hadn't done in a very long time, and one of the hands silently passed him the bread, and he took a piece and broke it and ate it without looking up. Clara didn't watch him. She had learned not to watch people too directly when she wanted to know something about them. You saw more from the corner of your eye. Nathaniel Carter ate half a bowl of stew and 2 pieces of cornbread, and then sat with his hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table in front of him with an expression she couldn't fully read. But it wasn't the closed, cold expression he had worn when he opened the front door that afternoon. This was something quieter, something more complicated, something that looked almost from the very edge of her peripheral vision like a man remembering what it felt like to be in a home. After supper, when the hands had cleared out and the kitchen was hers again, Clara washed the dishes herself and put the kitchen straight and checked her list for tomorrow's supply needs and thought about the week's menu. She was tired in a clean, satisfying way, the tiredness that comes from having done something well rather than simply having survived something hard, and that difference felt more valuable to her than she could have explained to anyone. She had been given a room off the back of the kitchen. Small, plain, clean enough. A narrow bed, a washstand, a hook on the wall for her coat. More than she'd had in several months. Far more than Harold's family had left her with. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened her notebook and began to write the supply list for the next morning. She was halfway through it when she heard footsteps in the kitchen. She went still. The footsteps stopped outside her door. A knock. Quiet, deliberate. "Miss Whitfield." Nathaniel Carter's voice. Clara put down her pen. "Yes," she said. A pause. "I wanted to tell you," he said through the closed door, and she could hear the particular quality of difficulty in the way he said it, the way a person sounds when they're doing something they're out of practice at, that supper was good. The men noticed. I noticed. Clara sat very still on the edge of her narrow bed. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she said. Another pause. Longer. "I'll make sure you have everything on your supply list by tomorrow afternoon," he said. "I appreciate that," she said. She heard him turn away, heard his footsteps cross the kitchen floor slower now than they had been before, heard the soft sound of the door to the main hallway opening and closing behind him. She sat for a moment in the quiet. Then she picked up her pen. She wrote one line at the bottom of her supply list that had nothing to do with food. "This house is not empty. It just forgot what it feels like to be full." She closed the notebook. She lay down on the narrow bed in her clothes, too tired to do more, and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into nighttime. A horse moving in the paddock wind against the window. The distant sound of one of the hands playing a harmonica somewhere in the direction of the bunkhouse. And somewhere in that house in one of the upstairs rooms, She had not yet seen a wealthy cowboy sat with his hands around an empty coffee cup and stared at the wall and tried to understand why a meal eaten in a room full of people had felt for the first time in 5 years like something other than a duty. He didn't have an answer, but for the first time in a very long time, the question itself felt worth asking. Outside, the Montana night was enormous and dark and full of stars, and at Carter Ranch, something had shifted in the air. Something small, something fragile, something that neither of them would have been able to name yet even if someone had asked. But it was there, and it was real, and it had begun. The morning after Clara's first supper at Carter Ranch, Nathaniel Carter came downstairs earlier than usual. He wouldn't have admitted that to anyone. He wouldn't have admitted that he had lain awake longer than he should have, or that when he finally did sleep, it was deeper and quieter than it had been in months, or that when he woke at 5 in the morning to the smell of coffee already made and something baking in the kitchen below. Something in his chest did a thing it hadn't done in a very long time. It loosened, just slightly, just enough to notice. He came down the stairs and pushed open the kitchen door and found Clara Whitfield already at the stove, her hair pinned back, her apron on, moving through that kitchen like she had been working in it for years rather than hours. She had rearranged things, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself loudly, but he could see it. The flour moved to a more logical shelf, the coffee tin closer to the stove. The cast iron pans hung in order of size on the rack above the work table. She had taken his kitchen and made it make sense. "You're up early," he said. Clara didn't turn around. "Ranch hands need breakfast by 6, she said. "Biscuits take 40 minutes start to finish if the oven is being cooperative. This oven," she added, with a tone that suggested the oven was not in fact being cooperative, "has opinions." Nathaniel almost smiled. He caught it before it fully formed the way he had learned to catch such things, and crossed to the coffee tin and poured himself a cup. "You could have asked Hector to handle breakfast," he said. "I could have," Clara agreed. She opened the oven door, checked whatever was inside, closed it again with a firm hand. "But I told you I'd feed your men well, and I meant it. I don't say things I don't mean, Mr. Carter." He stood with his coffee cup and watched her work and didn't say anything for a moment. "Where did you learn to cook?" he asked. "My mother," Clara said. "And then necessity. And then grief. Grief teaches you things if you let it. Mostly it teaches you that the only thing you can control when everything is falling apart is whether the people around you have something warm to eat." Nathaniel was quiet. She glanced back at him, then just briefly, and whatever she saw in his face made her turn fully and look at him with a directness that most people in his life had long since stopped attempting. "I'm sorry," she said. "That was clumsy of me. I didn't mean to—" "No," he said. "You didn't say anything wrong." A beat of silence between them. The kind that isn't empty, but full of things that neither of them had any intention of saying yet. "Your wife cooked?" Clara asked. The question was quiet but direct. She asked it the way someone asks a question when they genuinely want to know the answer, rather than performing curiosity. And that distinction was so unusual in Nathaniel's experience that it caught him off guard. "Elizabeth," he said. "Yes, she liked this kitchen." He looked at the room around him, and something moved through his face that he couldn't quite suppress. "She said a kitchen was the heart of a house, that you could tell everything about a family by their kitchen." "She was right," Clara said simply. Nathaniel set his coffee cup down. "She would have liked the biscuits," he said. He walked back out through the hallway before Clara could respond. She stood at the stove and listened to his footsteps on the stairs, and she pressed her lips together and thought that she understood for the first time something important about the particular architecture of grief that lived in this house. It wasn't absence. It was presence of the wrong kind. The presence of everything that used to be pressing against the walls like water against a dam. She turned back to the oven. She had biscuits to finish. By the end of the first week, the ranch hands had developed opinions. Tommy Briggs believed with the passionate conviction of a 19-year-old who had recently tasted something exceptional that Clara Whitfield was the finest cook in the entire state of Montana. He said this to anyone who would listen, and several who wouldn't, and he took to appearing at the kitchen window at odd hours, with requests that Clara handled with patient amusement. "Miss Clara," he said on Thursday morning, leaning against the windowsill with his hat in his hands, "do you reckon you could make that apple thing again? The warm one?" "I reckon I could," Clara said. "If you stop leaning on my window frame, you're letting flies in." Tommy straightened immediately. Old Pete Garner was subtler in his appreciation, which meant he ate twice as much as anyone else, and then complained about his digestion in a tone that made it clear he considered the situation entirely worth it. He had also, Clara noticed, begun washing his hands before supper, without being asked something she suspected had not been a regular practice previously. The other hands cycled through more gradually, some of them warming to her, quickly others taking longer. A few of the older ones watching her with the careful assessment of men who had seen hired help come and go, and were reserving judgment until they had more data. But by the end of that first week, there was something different at the dining table. People were talking. Not just the functional exchange of pass the bread and get that away from me, but actual conversation. Stories from the workday. Opinions about the cattle they'd moved. An argument about the best route through the northern pasture that got genuinely heated before old Pete settled it by drawing a map in gravy on the table, which Clara let stand for the duration of the argument and then cleaned up without comment. Nathaniel noticed. He noticed in the way quiet people notice things, not loudly, not with comment, but completely. He sat at the head of his table and watched his men talk and argue and laugh and reach across each other for the bread, and he felt something that he had almost forgotten the shape of. He felt like he was somewhere, not just somewhere physically, not just at his own table in his own house, but somewhere in the way that a person is somewhere when they belong to it, when it belongs to them, when the space around them is alive in the right way. He hadn't felt that since Elizabeth. It frightened him. Not in a way he could name. Not in a way he would have been willing to discuss. But in the deep animal way that people who have lost something enormous are frightened of anything that resembles having it again, because having it again means the possibility of losing it again, and that particular loss nearly killed him the first time. He started being difficult, not cruelly. Nathaniel Carter was not at his core a cruel man, but he started finding things to criticize about the kitchen. The supply orders were too large. The sugar expenditure was excessive. He didn't see why the men needed 3 courses at supper when 2 had served them fine for the previous 5 years. Clara let him say his piece, every time, and then she said her piece right back. "The sugar expenditure," she told him on the second Monday, standing at the work table with her hands covered in flour and her eyes steady on his face, "accounts for roughly 4% of your total weekly provisions cost. The men are working 12-hour days in summer heat. Something sweet at the end of the day is not a luxury, Mr. Carter. It's medicine. Costs less than the whiskey they'd drink if they were miserable enough to need it." Nathaniel stared at her. "That's a hell of a comparison," he said. "It's an accurate one," Clara said. "Now, if you want to argue about the butter, I'm ready for that too. Or you could let me do the job you hired me to do." He left the kitchen. He came back 20 minutes later. He didn't say anything. He just refilled his coffee cup and stood at the kitchen counter and watched her work. And Clara understood in the way she was coming to understand the various languages of Nathaniel Carter's silences that this one meant something close to fine. "You've made your point, and possibly also I don't entirely know what to do with a person who argues back and doesn't back down." She filed that away. It was on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week that the first real crack appeared. Clara had gone to the root cellar to check the potato stores. They were going faster than she had planned. For the men ate more than she had initially accounted for, which she took as a compliment, and on her way back through the yard, she passed the open door of the barn and heard a sound that stopped her walking. It was Nathaniel's voice, but not in any register she had heard from him before. She was not a person who eavesdropped. She had always considered it a meanness listening to what people said when they believed they were private. But she wasn't eavesdropping. She was simply stopped in the middle of the yard because the sound coming from inside that barn was not something she could simply walk past and forget. He was talking to a horse. She knew that much from the low occasional sound of the animal shifting its weight, the soft exhalation of a large creature being attended to carefully. But it was what he was saying that held her. "She made biscuits again this morning," Nathaniel said. "Same as Elizabeth used to. Not exactly the same. Different, but close enough that I couldn't—" He stopped. She heard him move. "I don't know what I'm doing, Copper. I don't know what I'm doing letting someone back into that kitchen. Into this place." Another pause. "She's not afraid of me. You notice that everyone else steps a little softer around me. She just looks at me, like she's reading something I didn't write." Clara stood very still in the yard. She had no business knowing this. She turned around and walked back the way she had come, quietly, and went back into the kitchen, and put the potatoes away, and stood at the work table with both hands flat on the wooden surface, and breathed slowly. Nathaniel Carter was not the man she had expected. She had expected a wealthy rancher who had grown hard. She had expected someone who had mistaken money for armor. She had found instead a person who had simply gone very quiet after a devastating loss, the way a person goes quiet when they are afraid that speaking will somehow make the absence worse. She knew that particular silence from the inside. She had lived in it for 2 years after Harold died. Not the grief itself. The grief was loud. The grief was savage. The grief came at you in the middle of ordinary moments and took your legs out from under you. But after the grief, the silence. The silence of having lost the person who was supposed to be there when the grief finally let you breathe. The silence of not knowing who you were anymore in a world that had rearranged itself without your consent. She had rebuilt herself in that silence. It had taken everything she had, and she thought, stirring something on the stove that didn't particularly need stirring, that Nathaniel Carter was still somewhere in the middle of his rebuilding, that he had stopped midway through, or perhaps hadn't known he was supposed to keep going. That this house, this silent, beautiful house that she was slowly bringing back to life, one meal at a time, was the physical form of a man who had put down the work of living and hadn't picked it up again. She thought about this for a long time, and then she thought carefully and deliberately that it was none of her business. She was the cook. She was here to feed 28 men and keep a kitchen running and earn the wages that would let her put enough money together to eventually find a more permanent situation. She was not here to fix anyone. She was not here to be anyone's salvation. She had been someone's salvation once, and it had cost her more than she'd known how to count. She would be the cook, nothing more. She told herself this with considerable conviction. And then the following Saturday happened. Saturdays were market days in Willow Creek. Clara had arranged with Nathaniel to take the small wagon into town every Saturday morning to collect the fresh provisions that couldn't be ordered in advance: eggs from the Hendersons, fresh vegetables from whoever had them, the occasional luxury item that made the week's cooking more interesting and the men's morale more sustainable. It was a 2-hour round trip, including time in the market. She went alone, which was her preference. She loaded what she needed into the wagon bed, settled herself on the seat, and drove into town with the particular quiet pleasure of a person who spends most of their time surrounded by people and treasures the occasional solitary hour. She should have known it wouldn't stay solitary. She was at the vegetable stall, Mrs. Peterson's, which had the best green beans in the county, and a reasonable price on summer squash, when she heard a voice behind her say clearly and with deliberate carrying power, "Well, would you look at what the Carter Ranch sends to market now?" She turned around. The woman was about 50, well-dressed in the Willow Creek sense of well-dressed, which meant her dress was clean and pressed, and she wore it with the particular posture of someone who considered themselves a social authority. She was standing with 2 other women of similar age and similar bearing, and all 3 of them were looking at Clara with the specific expression that Clara had spent her entire adult life learning to recognize and refuse to flinch from: assessment, dismissal, and underneath it, the peculiar cruelty of women who have found something to feel superior to. "Morning," Clara said pleasantly. She turned back to the green beans. I heard Nathaniel Carter hired himself a new cook, the woman said. I had imagined someone more practical. Clara didn't turn around. I'm very practical, she said. I find that people who question my practicality tend to be judging something other than my competence. A beat of silence. Well, said one of the other women in a tone of theatrical shock. My name is Mrs. Dorothea Hale, said the first woman louder, now the way people get louder when they haven't gotten the response they were reaching for. I've known Nathaniel Carter for 20 years. I knew Elizabeth. I find it interesting that he would bring someone like you into her home. Clara set down the green beans. She turned around. She looked at Dorothea Hale squarely, directly, without aggression and without apology. Someone like me, Clara repeated. Her voice was even. What kind of someone would that be, Mrs. Hale? Dorothea Hale's chin went up. A stranger, she said after a pause that lasted just long enough to make the word land harder than it would have otherwise. A stranger who nobody in this town knows anything about. Then I suppose you'll have to get to know me, Clara said. Or not. That's entirely your choice. But I have green beans to buy and a ranch full of men to feed, so if you'll excuse me. She paid Mrs. Peterson, who had been watching this exchange with her eyes very wide and her expression carefully neutral, and she gathered her purchases and walked back to the wagon. Her hands were steady. Her heart was going considerably faster than steady, a rapid, indignant beat that she had learned to live alongside over the years, the physical proof that she was not as untouchable as she tried to appear. But she had also learned that you did not show people like Dorothea Hale the interior of you. You showed them the surface that was calm and capable and utterly unbothered, and you saved the rest for somewhere private. She drove the wagon back to the ranch in the clear morning air and told herself that it didn't matter. She had heard worse. She had survived worse. She had walked 6 miles in summer heat with a suitcase and an empty stomach and knocked on the door of a stranger and asked for work, and she had done it without breaking. A woman with good posture and a mean disposition in a vegetable market was nothing, was less than nothing. She told herself this. By the time she reached the ranch, she almost believed it. She was unloading the wagon when she heard boots on the gravel behind her. Here, said Nathaniel's voice, and then his hands were there, taking the heavy crate of potatoes from her before she had fully registered that he was standing beside her. I'll get that. I can manage, Clara said. I know you can, Nathaniel said. I'm getting it anyway. He carried the crate toward the kitchen door. Clara took the smaller parcels and followed. They unloaded the wagon in a workable silence. Nathaniel carried the heavy things Clara directed where they went, and at no point did he comment on the fact that he had apparently decided to spend his Saturday morning helping the cook with the provisions, rather than doing whatever it was he had been doing before she pulled into the yard. When the last of it was put away, Nathaniel leaned against the doorframe and said, How was town? Clara began sorting through the eggs. Fine, she said. A pause. Clara. She looked up. He was watching her with that particular directness of his, the look that went past the surface, because he was... She had come to understand a man who had very little patience for surfaces. I asked how town was, he said. You said fine. Your jaw's been tight since you pulled in. She set down the eggs. I met a woman named Mrs. Dorothea Hale, Clara said. Something happened in Nathaniel's expression. What did she say to you? He asked. His voice had gone quieter, which she was learning meant the opposite of calmer. Nothing I haven't heard before, Clara said. It's fine. What did she say? It wasn't a question anymore. Clara looked at him. She questioned my suitability, she said carefully, for working in Elizabeth's home. She called me a stranger. She made it clear that she considers my presence here inappropriate. The silence that followed was not like the other silences. This one had an edge. Dorothea Hale, Nathaniel said very quietly, has been trying to run this ranch's business since Elizabeth died. She has opinions about who should work here, who should visit, and who I ought to be spending my time with. He pushed off the doorframe. None of those opinions are any of her concern. She seemed to think otherwise, Clara said. She's wrong. Mr. Carter. Nathaniel, he said. Clara stopped. He was looking at her with an expression that was not quite comfortable for either of them. An expression that acknowledged something shifting between them that neither of them had exactly intended or planned for. If you're going to argue with me about supply costs, and tell me that sugar is medicine, and refuse to back down when I'm being unreasonable, he said, then I think we're past the point where you have to call me Mr. Carter. A very long beat of quiet. All right, Clara said. And if Dorothea Hale says anything to you again, Nathaniel said, you come and tell me. I can handle Dorothea Hale. I know you can, he said. I'd like to handle her for you anyway. He left the kitchen. Clara stood with her hands on the edge of the work table. She stood there for a while. In town that same afternoon, Dorothea Hale held court in her sitting room with 4 of Willow Creek's most reliably interested ladies, and she told them everything she had seen and heard and concluded at the market that morning. She was a woman who experienced events most fully in the retelling of them, and by the time she had finished, the widow from Kansas had become a figure of considerable suspicion. A woman like that, Dorothea said, with the satisfied gravity of a person delivering a verdict, doesn't walk 6 miles in the heat to cook for strangers out of simple necessity. She has a plan. You mark my words. None of the women in that sitting room marked their words. But the story began to move the way stories in small towns always move, from sitting room to general store, from general store to the post office, from the post office to the saloon, and from the saloon to wherever stories go when they've outgrown their origin and taken on a life of their own. By the following Thursday, Clara was aware that she was being talked about. She knew it the way you know it when you walk into the general store and the conversation doesn't quite stop, but rearranges itself slightly when people look at you a half-second too long or a half-second too short. When Mrs. Peterson at the vegetable stall is friendlier than last time, in the specific way of someone making a deliberate point of being friendly. She said nothing about it. She went back to the ranch and made a roast chicken that reduced old Pete Garner, who had survived a Wyoming winter, on a boot to the kind of genuine silence that means a person has been moved somewhere past words. Miss Clara, Pete said finally. I don't know where you came from, and I don't know what you're doing here, but I want you to know that I will fight any man who tries to send you away. I appreciate that, Pete, Clara said, though I hope it won't come to that. It won't, said Tommy Briggs with the absolute confidence of a 19-year-old. Boss wouldn't let it. You should see how he talks about you. Clara looked up. Tommy went slightly red. That is, he said. What I mean is he seems the food has been real good is what I meant. Tommy, Clara said. Ma'am? Eat your chicken. Yes, ma'am. She did not think about what Tommy had said. She thought about it constantly. She was in the kitchen late on a Friday evening when it happened, the moment that she would later identify as the point after which nothing between them was quite the same as it had been before. She had been on her feet since 5 in the morning. She was tired in the way that she had learned to function inside the specific weariness of a person who pushes past their limit regularly enough that the limit starts to feel like ordinary ground. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, her recipe notebook open in front of her, trying to plan the following week's menu and failing because her eyes kept losing their focus on the page. The kitchen door opened. Nathaniel. He stopped when he saw her. You're still up, he said. Menu planning, Clara said. She straightened in her chair and reached for her pen with the automatic motion of a person who doesn't like being caught resting. Stop, Nathaniel said. She looked at him. He came into the kitchen, and he looked slightly awkward in a way she hadn't seen from him before, uncertain in a way that didn't fit his normal bearing. You don't need to pretend. You look exhausted. I'm fine. You've been on your feet for 14 hours. So have your ranch hands. My ranch hands, he said, are not planning next week's menu at 11 o'clock at night. They are asleep. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which surprised her. He picked up her cold teacup, stood back up, set it on the stove to reheat, sat back down. Did all of this with the slightly clumsy deliberateness of a man who is performing a caring gesture while being deeply uncertain of the protocol. "I want to ask you something." "All right," Clara said. "When you left Kansas," he said, "was there anyone? Did you leave anyone family?" The question was careful. She could hear the care in it the way he had chosen those particular words and arranged them in that particular order. "No," Clara said. "Harold's family made it clear they didn't consider me family after he was gone. My own people are gone. I have a friend, back in Abilene, a woman named Ruth who writes me letters when she knows where I am." She paused. "That's about the extent of it." Nathaniel was quiet. "Nobody looked for you," he said. "When you left." "Mr. Carter. Nathaniel. Nathaniel." She tried the name out again, and it sat differently in her mouth than she expected. "Nobody looked for me because nobody had any reason to expect that I was worth looking for." She said it plainly without self-pity, in the way she had learned to say true things about herself that used to hurt and had now simply become part of the geography of her history. "I was Harold's wife. When Harold was gone, I was nobody's anything. That's just how it was." Nathaniel looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. "That's a hell of a thing," he said quietly. "To be made to feel like you disappear when someone leaves." Clara felt something in her chest do a thing she had not given it permission to do. "Yes," she said. "It is." A long beat of quiet settled over the kitchen. "My ranch hands think you hung the moon," Nathaniel said. The shift in tone was deliberate. She understood he was giving her an exit from the intimacy of the previous exchange, and she was grateful for it. "Tommy Briggs told me yesterday that if I ever let you go, the whole crew would follow you to wherever you ended up." Clara laughed. It startled her, the laugh. It came out before she had managed it full and genuine, and she pressed her hand over her mouth for a second and then took it away, because she was not going to apologize for laughing. Nathaniel was smiling. Actually smiling. Not the almost smile she had caught a few times before. A real one, small and quiet but present, changing the whole quality of his face. "He said that," Clara said. "He said exactly that," Nathaniel said. "He also tried to get me to put you in the will, but I told him that was a conversation for another time." Clara laughed again. And Nathaniel laughed, too low and brief and rusty, the way a laugh sounds when it hasn't been used in a while. And the sound of it in that kitchen at 11 o'clock at night did something to the air of the room that Clara had no intention of examining too closely. Her tea was warm again. She wrapped her hands around the cup and looked down at it. "I should plan the menu," she said. "You should sleep," Nathaniel said. "In a minute." He stood up. He stood at the kitchen table and looked at her for a moment with that expression she still couldn't fully read, the one that wasn't closed anymore, but wasn't entirely open yet. Either the one that existed in the exact middle distance between keeping himself and letting himself. "Clara," he said. "Yes. I'm glad you knocked on that door," he said. 3 weeks ago. I'm glad you walked the 6 miles. She looked up at him. The kitchen was quiet and warm, and it was late, and they were the only 2 people awake in the whole of Carter Ranch, and the moment had a weight to it that she felt in her hands, and her sternum, and the back of her throat. "I'm glad you opened it," she said. He nodded once. He walked out of the kitchen. Clara sat with her tea for a long time after he left, and in the town of Willow Creek, in the comfortable sitting room of Dorothea Hale, a different conversation was happening. A conversation about a letter, about a name, about a widow from Kansas, whose past someone was suggesting might be more complicated than anyone had yet understood. About a man named Richard Holloway, who was coming to Montana with an interest in Carter Ranch's water rights. And about how sometimes the best way to break a man was not to come at him directly, but to come at the thing he had just started carefully and against all his instincts to care about. Showmore Richard Holloway arrived on a Tuesday. Clara knew something was wrong before she ever saw the man's face. She knew it the way you know Weather is changing before the sky shows you something in the air. Something in the way Nathaniel came through the kitchen that morning without stopping for coffee, without the half-second pause at the doorway that had become, in 4 weeks, as reliable as a clock. He moved through the house with a different quality of purpose, tight and directed. And when she heard the sound of a wagon pulling into the yard, and then voices on the front porch, she stayed at her work table and listened to the particular silence that followed. Not the good kind of silence. The kind that comes before something breaks. She found out the details from Tommy, who found out from one of the older hands named Webb, who had been in the yard when the wagon arrived and had the particular gift of men who've spent their lives around livestock, the ability to read the intent of a creature before it shows its hand. Man named Holloway, Tommy told her at lunch, leaning across the kitchen threshold with his voice dropped low. Real fancy dresser. Came with 2 other men's suits, not work clothes. Webb says he's heard the name before out of Billings. Says Holloway buys land. Buys it or... He paused. Or what? Clara said. Or he finds ways to make people sell it, Tommy said. Ways that don't look like forcing but are. Clara set down her knife. Did he say what he wanted? Water rights, Tommy said. The creek that runs through the north pasture. Webb says whoever controls that creek controls grazing for about 40 square miles in every direction. Clara thought about what Nathaniel had said about that pasture 3 days ago, when he had come through the kitchen at dusk and she had handed him a plate of leftover biscuits without being asked, and he had taken them without pretending he didn't want them. And in the easy silence that had developed between them, he had talked about the land, the way he always talked about it like it was a member of the family. He had said the North Creek was the reason his grandfather had built here. That as long as the water ran, the ranch lived. That without it, Carter Ranch was just a big piece of expensive dirt. She hadn't thought much about it at the time. She thought about it now. Tommy, she said, where is Mr. Carter right now? Study, Tommy said. Doors closed. And Holloway? Still in there with him. Clara picked up her knife again. Thank you, she said. Tommy lingered. Miss Clara, he said. Webb also said he said Holloway's the kind of man who doesn't take no for an answer the first time. Most men like that, Clara said evenly, have never met a woman who means it. She went back to her work. But her hands moved faster than they needed to, and she was listening beneath the ordinary sounds of the kitchen for anything coming from the direction of the closed study door at the front of the house. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it ended, she heard the front door, heard boots on the porch steps, heard the wagon pulling out of the yard. She gave it 10 minutes. Then she put together a plate, nothing fancy, leftover bread and cold sliced meat, and a small pot of coffee, and she carried it to the study and knocked. Leave it, Nathaniel said from inside. I'm not leaving it, Clara said. I'm bringing it in. A pause. Clara, you haven't eaten since this morning, she said through the door. Whatever's happened, it'll look better after food. It always does. That is not sentimentality, that is physiology. The silence on the other side of that door lasted long enough that she thought he wasn't going to respond. Then she heard the chair move. The door opened. He looked the way men look when they've spent 2 hours holding themselves very still inside a room while something difficult was being said to them, like the stillness has cost them something and they're only now beginning to reckon with the price. His jaw was set. His eyes had gone to the particular dark quality they got when he was working something through that he hadn't finished working. He stepped back from the door. She came in and set the plate and the coffee on the desk and stood back. He sat down. He ate a piece of bread without tasting it, she could tell. He wants the North water rights, Nathaniel said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the desk or at something beyond it. Offered me 3 times what they're worth on paper. And what did you say? Clara asked. I said no. Good. He smiled when I said it, Nathaniel said. That's what bothers me. When a man hears no and smiles, he either didn't believe you or he already has a different plan. He picked up the coffee. Holloway has been acquiring land up and down this valley for 2 years. Nobody's said no to him yet. When Webb told me that just now, I realized... He stopped. You realized he's not used to it, Clara said. I realized he's not going to accept it, Nathaniel said. The room got very quiet. Clara looked at him. What does that mean practically? It means he'll find another way, Nathaniel said. He'll look for leverage, something he can use to make the situation uncomfortable enough that no becomes yes. He set down the coffee cup. He did it to the Mercer family up in Cascade County. Found an old debt, a disputed property line made enough noise about it that the Mercers decided selling was easier than fighting. But there's no debt here, Clara said. No disputed line. Nathaniel looked at her then. And in his look was something she didn't like. Something that wasn't quite fear. Nathaniel Carter was not a man who frightened easily, but was adjacent to it. Something more like the look of a man who has just identified a vulnerability he hadn't known he had until this moment. No, he said slowly. There's no debt here. She held his gaze. Say what you're thinking, she said. I'm thinking, he said carefully, that a man who wants leverage looks for whatever is new, whatever is recent, whatever someone has that he didn't have 6 months ago and might not be willing to risk. The silence stretched. Clara understood what he was saying. She understood it with perfect clarity, and the understanding was like cold water shocking first, then numbingly complete. He was saying her. She was the new thing. She took a breath. I see, she said. I'm not suggesting, he started. I know what you're not suggesting, Clara said. And I know what you are, and you're right to think it. She kept her voice steady. She was very good at keeping her voice steady when everything else was moving. I came here without any connections in this town. I have no family, no long history here, nothing to vouch for me except my cooking and your word. That makes me useful to someone who wants a lever. Clara, it's all right, she said. I'd rather know. Nathaniel stood up. He moved to stand closer to her. Not in a crowding way, not in any way she could have objected to, just closer, so that when he spoke, she heard it at a register that was meant only for her. Nothing is going to happen to you, he said. I want to be very clear about that. Whatever Holloway thinks he can do, he is not going to. You can't promise that, Clara said. I can promise that I won't let it happen without a fight, Nathaniel said. She looked up at him. He looked back. And something passed between them that was not quite the thing that had been building in late-night kitchens and Saturday morning yards, and the accidental intimacy of two people sharing the same space for 4 weeks. It was something harder than that, something forged from something other than warmth. It was the specific look of two people who have decided in the same moment and without discussing it that they are on the same side. All right, Clara said. All right, Nathaniel agreed. She gathered the plate and the coffee things. She walked back to the kitchen, and she thought very hard for the rest of that afternoon about Richard Holloway's smile. The rumors started on Friday. Clara didn't hear them firsthand. She heard them the way you hear things in a small town when you are the subject of them, in the gaps, in the hesitations, in the way Mrs. Peterson at the Saturday market was friendly in a slightly more deliberate way than usual, in the way two women near the post office stopped talking when Clara walked past and then resumed at a slightly lower volume. She told herself it was nothing. By the following Tuesday, it was not nothing. Tommy came to the kitchen before breakfast with his hat in his hands and his face arranged into the particular expression of a young man who is about to say something he wishes he didn't have to. Miss Clara, he said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I don't believe a word of it. Clara set down her spoon. Tell me, she said. In town, Tommy said. People are saying they're saying your husband, Harold, that he was involved in something. Before he died. Some kind of financial trouble. That he cheated people. He swallowed. And that you knew. That you left Kansas because people there knew, and you came here to find another situation before anyone could. He stopped. He couldn't finish it. Clara was very still. Inside her chest something was happening that she recognized from her worst years. The cold spreading feeling of a thing you thought you had outrun, turning around and finding you anyway. The specific despair of learning that distance doesn't protect you, that the past has longer arms than you'd hoped. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Her voice was level. "Miss Clara." "Who started it?" she asked. "Do you know?" Tommy hesitated. "Webb heard it from the man who drinks at the saloon," he said. "Man said he heard it from someone who'd come up from Billings, someone who claimed to know people back in Kansas." Billings, where Richard Holloway operated out of. Clara sat down on the stool beside the work table. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and looked at nothing in particular while she organized what she was feeling into something she could work with. Harold had not cheated anyone. Harold had been a careful, honest man who kept his accounts in a small leather book and checked them every Sunday evening, and knew to the penny what he owed and what he was owed. He had died with a clean record and a good name, and the only injustice attached to his death was what his family had done to Clara in the aftermath of it. She knew this. She also knew that knowing it was not the same as being able to prove it to people who had already decided what they wanted to believe. She stood up. She took off her apron. "Watch the stove," she said to Tommy. "Don't let the porridge catch." "Where are you going?" Tommy asked. "To talk to Nathaniel," she said. She found him in the barn, which she had learned was where he went when he was thinking through something he didn't want to think through in the house. He was working on a piece of harness that probably didn't need working on the same way she sometimes kneaded bread dough past the point it needed kneading, because physical work gave the mind somewhere to put itself. She came through the barn door, and he looked up. He read her face in about 2 seconds. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting, which she had learned was how he always listened completely, without filling in the gaps, without the restless impatience of people who are formulating their response while you're still speaking. When she finished, he put down the harness. "He moved faster than I expected," Nathaniel said. "You expected this." "I expected something like this," he said. "I didn't know what shape it would take." He was already thinking she could see it in his face. Not the angry thinking, not the reactive kind, but the deep methodical kind that meant he was 3 steps ahead already in building. "Harold, tell me about him. Tell me everything. What he did, who he knew, who his creditors were, what his accounts looked like." "Nathaniel, I'm not asking because I doubt you," he said. "Firm clear, no room for misunderstanding. I'm asking because if Holloway is going to use forged information about your husband to create leverage, I need to know enough about the truth to identify exactly where he lied." Clara looked at him. She thought about how long it had been since anyone had approached her problems as if they were also their problems. As if her defense was a matter of course rather than a favor. "Harold was a dry goods merchant," she said. "Small operation. He kept his books himself. He had 2 business loans, one from a bank in Abilene, one from a private lender named Beaumont, who was a friend of his father's. Both paid on time every month. When Harold died, there was enough in the accounts to settle both. His brother collected it." She paused. The brother. I think if someone wanted to make Harold look guilty of something financial, the brother would be the easiest starting point. He handled everything after the death. He had access to the books. Nathaniel was very still. "What's the brother's name?" he said. "Gerald," Clara said. "Gerald Whitfield. He's still in Kansas as far as I know. Lawrence, Kansas." "And what does Gerald Whitfield look like?" Clara frowned. "What does that have to do with—" "Because Richard Holloway came here from Billings with 2 men in suits," Nathaniel said, "and one of those men Webb told me this morning had a Kansas accent." The barn went very quiet. Clara felt it then, the full shape of it, the architecture of what was being built against her. Not just rumors, not just a whisper campaign. A constructed story with a witness, with a source, with a name attached to it. Her own brother-in-law, the man who had taken everything Harold left behind, now willing to cross state lines to take whatever she had managed to build for herself since. "Gerald always blamed me," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. "He blamed me for he said I wasn't good enough for Harold, that Harold had done better before me and would have done better after. She stopped. He said that at the funeral. He said it in front of people. Nathaniel's jaw was tight. He said that at your husband's funeral, he said flatly. Yes? With you standing there. Yes. The silence from Nathaniel had a quality she had not encountered from him before. It wasn't the cold silence or the grief silence or the thinking silence. It was the silence of controlled fury, the very specific stillness of a man who is holding something back with considerable effort. He's here to destroy you, Nathaniel said, and Holloway is paying him to do it. Because Holloway thinks if your reputation is gone, I'll want you off this ranch. And if you're gone, I'll be alone again and off balance and more likely to sell. Is he right? Clara asked. The question came out before she could stop it. She wished immediately that she could take it back, not because it wasn't a fair question, but because of what it revealed about her. About the fact that some part of her was still braced for the moment when the ground gave way again, when someone she had allowed herself to trust decided she wasn't worth the trouble. Nathaniel looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. No, he said. The word was simple and absolute and without qualification. He is not right. You're not going anywhere, and we're going to fix this. Clara breathed. Just breathed. How? She said. I need to make a trip to the county courthouse, he said. And I need to send a wire to a man I know in Abilene who handles property law. And then, he said, I need you to write down everything you remember about Harold's accounts. Every creditor, every lender, every amount, every date. Everything. Can you do that? Yes, she said. Good. He picked up the harness again, not to work on it, she understood, but because he needed something in his hands while he thought. Holloway's going to move again soon. He'll want to escalate before I can establish a defense. That means we don't have much time. Nathaniel, Clara said. He looked at her. If this gets worse, she said, if it gets bad enough that my being here is truly hurting the ranch, hurting you. Don't, he said. I need to say it. And I need you to hear me, he said. I told you that first night that you could come in. I meant that. I don't unmean things, Clara. I don't open a door and then close it because someone outside is making noise. He held her gaze. You are not the problem. Holloway is the problem. Don't you ever confuse those two things. She nodded. She left the barn. She went back to the kitchen and relieved Tommy from porridge duty and finished making breakfast and fed 30 men and cleaned the kitchen and started lunch, and she did all of it with her hands and the front of her mind, while the back of her mind worked on something else entirely. She was thinking about Gerald Whitfield. She was thinking about the fact that her brother-in-law, a man she had not seen since the morning he walked out of what had been her home carrying the last of Harold's things in a box under his arm, had traveled from Kansas to Montana to help a land speculator destroy her name. She was thinking about why, and she was thinking carefully precisely the way she thought about a meal that had to come out right on the first attempt, because there wouldn't be a second about what Gerald might have that could be turned against him. What he might have done with Harold's accounts. What traces a dishonest man might have left in a ledger that he thought nobody was ever going to look at again. Because Richard Holloway was not the only person in this situation who could construct a story from available evidence. And Clara Whitfield had always been very, very good at working with what was in front of her. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It came addressed to Clara, care of Carter Ranch, in handwriting she didn't recognize. The envelope was plain. No return address. It had been sent from Billings. She opened it at the kitchen table while the bread was rising. It was short. 3 sentences. You know what your husband did. Staying quiet has protected you until now. Leave Carter Ranch before what happened in Kansas follows you to Montana, and this can still end quietly. She read it twice. She folded it. She put it in the pocket of her apron. She went back to the bread. She thought very carefully about what a woman was supposed to do when she received a letter like this. The obvious answer, the answer that fear wanted her to arrive at, was the one the letter was designed to produce: panic, then compliance. Pack the suitcase again. Walk away again. Find another road. She had been walking away from things her entire adult life. Walked away from Harold's family. Walked away from Kansas. Walked away from every situation where someone with more power had decided she was the easier problem to remove. She was tired of walking away. She was tired of being the easier problem. She took the letter out of her apron pocket. She walked through the house to Nathaniel's study. She knocked. "Come in," he said. She went in. She put the letter on his desk. He read it. The muscle in his jaw did the thing it did when he was angry. The subtle tightening that she had learned to read the way she read the stove's temperature by the specific quality of the heat it gave off. "When did this arrive?" he said. "This morning," Clara said. "With the regular post." "They want you frightened," he said. "I know." "Are you—" She looked at him directly. "Yes," she said. "But I'm not leaving." Something in Nathaniel's face shifted in a way she felt more than saw a movement beneath the surface that changed the quality of the air between them. "Good," he said. He folded the letter and put it in his desk drawer. "I heard back from my contact in Abilene this morning," he said. "He's been looking into Whitfield's handling of Harold's estate. He says there are irregularities. Small ones, but findable if you know where to look." He paused. "It appears that the money Harold left, the money Gerald claimed went to creditors, some of it went somewhere else." Clara sat down. Not because she was unsteady, because this was the kind of information that deserved a person sitting down when they heard it. "He stole it," she said. "Some of it," Nathaniel said. "Enough that if it came to light, Gerald Whitfield's credibility as a witness to anything becomes considerably more complicated." Clara thought about Harold, about his careful Sunday evenings with the ledger book, about how hard he had worked for everything they'd had, and how little of it had survived the week after his death. "He worked his whole life for what was in that account," she said. Her voice was steady, her hands were steady, but something behind her eyes was not steady, and she knew Nathaniel could see it, because he had always been able to see more than she showed, and at this particular moment, she did not have the energy to hide what she was feeling behind the surface she usually maintained. "I know," Nathaniel said quietly. "Harold was a good man," she said. "He deserved better than what his family did to him, to us." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "He did." She breathed. She pressed her hands flat on her knees. "What do we do with this?" she said. "We keep it," Nathaniel said. "We let Holloway make his next move. And when he does, when he brings Gerald Whitfield in front of people and asks them to believe his story, we show them what kind of man Gerald Whitfield actually is." "That's a risk," Clara said. "If Holloway moves first—" "He will move first," Nathaniel said. "That's fine. Let him. A man who thinks he holds all the cards plays them confidently. A confident man doesn't look for the one he missed." Clara looked at him. "You've done this before," she said. It wasn't a question. Something moved across his face. "My father lost half this ranch in a bad land deal when I was 17, Nathaniel said. "A man named Dawes. Used forged paperwork, bribed a county clerk, very nearly took everything. My father didn't fight it because he didn't know how." He paused. "I watched him lose things he'd built his whole life because nobody told him he was allowed to fight back." "But you knew," Clara said. "I learned," Nathaniel said. The difference mattered. She understood then, or understood more fully than she had before, the particular architecture of what drove Nathaniel Carter. Not just the loss of Elizabeth, though that loss had reshaped him entirely. But something older than that. Something formed in the watching of a good man being taken from. The deep and structural conviction that the world contained people who took things, and that the appropriate response was not acceptance, but preparation. He had been prepared for Holloway. He just hadn't expected that the lever Holloway would choose was her. "I'm sorry," Clara said. Nathaniel frowned. "What are you apologizing for?" "For being the complication," she said. "For being the thing he found." "You are not a complication," Nathaniel said. He said it with the same flat certainty with which he'd said no when she asked if Holloway was right. The same voice that did not leave room for argument, because it was not inviting one. "You are the person who showed up on my doorstep 6 weeks ago and reminded this house what it felt like to be lived in." His voice was quiet, but it carried in the study's stillness. "You are not a complication, Clara. You are the point." She had no answer for that. She had no answer, and she did not look away, and neither did he, and the moment stretched between them like something that was waiting to become something else, like a question that had been in the room for weeks and was finally, in the particular quality of this particular afternoon, beginning to ask itself aloud. Then from outside came the sound of Tommy's voice calling from the yard, and the sound of horses arriving more than one, and Nathaniel stood and went to the window and went very still in the way he went still when something he had been expecting had arrived sooner than he wanted. "Holloway," he said. Clara stood. "He's back," she said. "With more men this time," Nathaniel said. "And—" He stopped. "What?" He turned from the window. "There's a man with him," he said, "that I don't recognize, wearing a brown coat, about 50, heavy set." Clara felt the cold spread through her chest before he finished the sentence, because she recognized that description. She didn't need to look out the window. She already knew. "That's Gerald," she said. The room went absolutely still. Nathaniel looked at her. Clara looked back at him, and whatever had been building between them, whatever careful, fragile, extraordinary thing had been constructed over 6 weeks of shared kitchens and late nights and hard conversations and small, brave moments. She felt it harden in that instant into something different, something less tender and more solid, something that was not romance, not yet, not with Gerald Whitfield standing in the yard, but was the thing that sometimes comes before romance and outlasts it. It was trust. Complete, unconditional, and mutual. "Together," Nathaniel said. "Together." Clara agreed. He opened the study door. And they walked toward whatever was coming side by side without hesitation and without pretense, two people who had both lost everything once and had decided without quite knowing when they had decided it that they were not going to lose again. They walked out onto the front porch together. Nathaniel went first one step ahead, not in a way that pushed Clara behind him, but in the way of a man who puts his body between something dangerous and something he intends to protect. Clara came out beside him a half-second later and stood at his right, and she kept her hands loose at her sides, and her face arranged into the expression she had spent years perfecting, the one that showed nothing, cost nothing, gave nothing away. Richard Holloway stood in the yard with 4 men behind him. He was exactly as Tommy had described him. Expensive clothes, careful posture, a smile that arrived on his face a fraction of a second after his eyes did, which meant it was a decision rather than a reflex. A calculated man, a man who planned ahead and planned carefully and was accustomed to having those plans work. Beside him, slightly behind and to the left, stood Gerald Whitfield. Clara had not seen her brother-in-law in 2 years. He looked smaller than she remembered, which surprised her. In her memory, he had the large, imposing quality of someone who had caused her real damage. But standing in Nathaniel Carter's yard in the Montana summer, he looked like what he actually was. A middle-aged man with a soft jaw and a borrowed authority that didn't quite fit him. He was wearing a coat that was too heavy for the weather. He was sweating. His eyes found Clara immediately, and then slid away, which told her everything she needed to know about his conscience. "Mr. Carter," Holloway said pleasantly. "Hope we're not interrupting." "You are," Nathaniel said. "What do you want, Holloway?" The pleasantness on Holloway's face adjusted slightly, but didn't leave. "I'd like to continue our conversation from last week," he said. "I've brought someone with me who I think will be useful to clarify a few things." "Clarify what things?" Nathaniel said. Holloway glanced at Clara. The glance was brief and precise and said everything without saying anything. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I'm concerned that you may not have complete information about certain individuals currently employed on your property. I have complete enough information, Nathaniel said. I'm not sure you do, Holloway said. He gestured toward Gerald. This is Gerald Whitfield of Lawrence, Kansas. He was the brother-in-law of the woman standing next to you, and he has some things he'd like to share regarding her late husband's business dealings. Dealings that were, he paused, selecting the word irregular. Gerald stepped forward. He still wasn't looking at Clara. Harold Whitfield owed money, Gerald said. His voice had the careful quality of a prepared statement, something rehearsed. At the time of his death, there were outstanding debts to several parties. Debts that I was left to settle, with money that should have gone to Gerald, Clara said. Her voice was not loud. It cut him off completely. He stopped. His eyes came to her face. And whatever he saw there, or perhaps whatever he had expected to see and didn't find, made him swallow. "Hello, Gerald," Clara said. He said nothing. "I'm going to ask you a question," Clara said, "and I'd like you to answer it honestly. Just once. Just this one time." She kept her voice level, almost gentle, the way you speak to someone you are not afraid of anymore. "Did Harold owe anyone money when he died?" Gerald's jaw tightened. There were debts. "Did Harold owe anyone money when he died?" Clara repeated. "Yes or no?" A pause. Holloway shifted slightly beside him. "There were complications in the accounts," Gerald said. "That's not a yes or a no," Clara said. "Miss Whitfield," Holloway began. "Mrs. Whitfield," Clara said, and turned to look at him directly. "And I'm not speaking to you yet. I'll get there." Something moved across Holloway's face. Surprise brief and quickly covered. He was not used to being told to wait. Nathaniel beside her said nothing. He was letting her run it. She had not asked him to. He had simply understood in the way he understood things that this was hers to handle, and that the best thing he could do was stand beside her while she did. "Gerald," Clara said, turning back to her brother-in-law. Harold kept his accounts in a brown leather book. Small. He kept it in the left-hand drawer of his desk. When you cleaned out the house after he died, you took that book. I watched you put it in your coat pocket. She paused. "I'd like you to tell Mr. Holloway and these other gentlemen what was in it." Gerald said nothing. "I'll tell them instead," Clara said. Harold had 2 business loans, one from First Bank of Abilene for $800, originated in 1882, paid down to a remaining balance of $210 at the time of his death. One private loan from a man named Beaumont, $400 fully paid as of January of 1887. Both lenders could confirm this. Both have records. She took a breath. Harold died with more in his accounts than he owed. I know this because I kept the household accounts. I know this because I am very good at numbers, Gerald, which you knew, and which is part of why you wanted me out of that house before I could look too carefully at what you were doing. The yard was very quiet. Gerald's face had gone the kind of still that faces go when a person is calculating furiously behind them. "You can't prove," he started. "I have a lawyer in Abilene," Nathaniel said. It was the first time he had spoken since Clara began, and the effect was considerable, not because the words themselves were complicated, but because of the quality of his voice when he said them. Flat. Certain. "A man who does not make claims he cannot back. Name of Breckenridge," Nathaniel continued. "He's been looking at the records from Harold Whitfield's estate for the past 10 days. He's found some things. Not everything yet, but enough." He looked at Holloway. "Enough to make Gerald Whitfield a very poor choice of witness for anyone who needs their case to hold up under scrutiny." Holloway's smile for the first time went slightly stiff. "That's a serious allegation," he said. "It's a documented one," Nathaniel said. "I'd be happy to show you what Breckenridge has sent me so far if you'd like to come inside. But I suspect," he said, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who has been patient for the precise amount of time that patience requires, "that you'd rather take your men and your witness and get off my property." Holloway looked at him. He looked at Clara. He looked at Gerald, and whatever he saw in Gerald's face confirmed something for him, because the calculation behind Holloway's eyes became visible for just a moment, The rapid professional assessment of a man deciding whether his position was worth defending or whether retreat was the more strategic option. "This isn't finished," Holloway said. "I know it isn't," Nathaniel said. "But today it is. Get off my land." Holloway adjusted his coat. He turned to his men. He walked back toward the wagon without another word. The walk of a man who is leaving by choice rather than being expelled, maintaining the fiction of control until the last possible moment. Gerald followed him. He passed within 6 feet of Clara on his way to the wagon. He stopped. He looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time since he had arrived. And his face was complicated in the way of people who are somewhere between shame and defensiveness and haven't settled on either. "You always thought you were better than us," he said, quietly. Not cruelly exactly, more like a man making an argument he no longer fully believes. "Harold, too, Harold loved you," Clara said. "He talked about you. Before things went wrong between you, he talked about you the way a person talks about family. They miss." She held Gerald's gaze. "Whatever happened to that, it wasn't Harold's fault, and it wasn't mine. You know that. You've always known that." Gerald looked away. He walked to the wagon. He didn't look back. The wagon pulled out of the yard. Tommy Briggs, who had been standing near the barn with several other hands in the particular way of people trying to look like they were doing something else, while watching everything, let out a breath that was audible from 20 feet. "Well," said old Pete Garner from somewhere to the left, "that was something." Nathaniel turned to Clara. She was still watching the road where the wagon had gone. "Clara," he said. She turned, and the expression on her face was not the one he expected. Not relief, not triumph. It was something older and more tired and more real than either of those things. It was the expression of a person who has just done something necessary and is now feeling the full weight of what it cost. "I need to sit down," she said. "Kitchen," he said immediately. "Yes," she agreed. They went inside. The next 3 days were the quiet before the real storm, and both of them knew it. Holloway had retreated, but not surrendered. Clara understood the difference, and she suspected Nathaniel did too, because he sent Webb into town each morning to watch for signs of movement, and received each report with the same careful attention he gave to weather and water levels. The information coming back from Breckenridge and Abilene was building into something real, but was not yet complete and incomplete. Weapons are dangerous to the person holding them as much as to the person being aimed at. Clara cooked. She cooked the way she always cooked in times of difficulty, purposefully, precisely, as if feeding people well was an act of resistance, which she had come to believe it was. She made things that took time, things that required attention, things that gave her hands and the front of her mind enough to do that the back of her mind could work. On the second evening, Nathaniel found her in the kitchen at 9 o'clock finishing a pie that nobody had asked for. He didn't say anything about the pie. He sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Tell me about Harold. Not the accounts, just tell me about him." Clara looked at him. "Why?" she asked. "Because you defended a man today," Nathaniel said, in front of his own brother. "You defended his name, and I don't know who he was." She sat down across from him. She thought for a moment. "He was quiet," she said. "Quieter than people expected. Most men in that town were loud, big voices, big opinions. Harold listened. He remembered things. He remembered everyone's name, what they'd told him last time, what they'd been worried about." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "He found me at a church social. I was standing by myself near the back because I always stood by myself near the back, and he came over and asked what I thought about the sermon, and I said I thought the minister had gone on too long about penance and not long enough about grace. And Harold laughed." She paused. "He laughed like it was the most honest thing he'd heard all month." "He sounds like a good man," Nathaniel said. "He was," Clara said. "He wasn't perfect. He was stubborn about certain things, and he had a temper when he felt disrespected, and he hated asking for help even when he needed it." She stopped. "But he was good. The kind of good that isn't a performance. The kind that's just how a person is." Nathaniel was quiet. "Elizabeth was like that," he said. Clara waited. She never performed anything, he said. Most people you can see the performance, the version they want you to see. Elizabeth didn't have one. What you saw was what she was. It was... He stopped, looked at his coffee cup. It's the hardest kind of person to lose, because you never have to translate them. And when they're gone, you realize that most of what you believed about the world was filtered through how they saw it, and you have to figure out how to see it on your own again. He paused. I hadn't managed it, until recently. Clara looked at him. She understood what he was saying. She understood it completely from the inside of her own experience of the same process. The long rebuilding that happened after grief finished the worst of its work and left you standing in the wreckage, asking what you were supposed to do now. It takes longer than people say, she said. Yes, Nathaniel said. It does. They sat with that for a moment, the two of them on opposite sides of the kitchen table, with their coffee cups and the late evening quiet of the house around them. And it was not uncomfortable. It was the very specific comfort of being with someone who has been to the same place and doesn't need it explained. On the third morning, Webb came back from town with a different quality of urgency. Clara saw it in the way he came off his horse. She was at the kitchen window, and she watched him cross the yard to the main house with his hat in his hands and his stride too fast for ordinary news, and she untied her apron and went into the hallway, because she was not going to stand in the kitchen and wait to be told something important. She got to the front hall at the same moment Nathaniel came down the stairs. Webb looked at both of them. Holloway's called a town meeting, he said. Tonight, at the courthouse. He's telling people it's about water rights across the valley, that it affects everyone, not just Carter Ranch. He paused. He's got Gerald Whitfield set to speak, and he's been to see Judge Harlan. Nathaniel went very still. Harlan, he said. What does that mean? Clara asked. It means he's moving this from a business negotiation to a legal action, Nathaniel said. His voice was controlled in the specific way it got when he was managing something beneath the surface. If Harlan's involved, Holloway intends to file some kind of formal complaint. About the water rights or, he looked at Clara, or about you. About me, Clara said. Not a question. Understanding it as it arrived. If he files a complaint about the legitimacy of someone employed here, Nathaniel said, using Gerald's testimony as the basis. Even a false complaint, even one we can ultimately disprove, it creates a legal cloud over the ranch, over me, over any of my word as a witness or a property holder. He was thinking fast, she could see it. It's not about winning in court, it's about making enough mess that I'd rather settle. Clara thought about this very quickly. Then we go tonight, she said. Both men looked at her. We go to the meeting, she said. We don't let him set the terms in a room we're not in. Clara, if Gerald is going to say things about Harold in front of people, Clara said, I want to be there when he says them. I want to be standing in that room where everyone can see me while he says them. Nathaniel was looking at her with that expression she had come to recognize over 8 weeks. The one that was not quite surprise, because she had largely stopped surprising him, but was something close to it. The expression of a man who keeps encountering something he didn't plan for, and is beginning to understand that the not planning for it was the limitation, not the thing itself. All right, he said. All right, Webb repeated with the slightly bewildered expression of a man who has delivered urgent news and received a different response than he expected. We go tonight, Nathaniel said. Webb, I need you to ride to the Henderson place, and the Paulson place, and the Garrity farm. Tell them there's something happening at the courthouse tonight that affects their water too. Tell them to come. He turned toward the stairs. And tell Pete to get the wagon ready. Webb went. Nathaniel looked at Clara. This is going to be harder than the yard, he said. I know, she said. Whatever Gerald says, I know, she said again. You don't have to stand still for it, Nathaniel said. You don't have to take it quietly. I know I don't, Clara said. but I think I'm going to. I think quiet is scarier than loud in a room full of people. I think a woman who doesn't flinch is harder to dismiss than a woman who fights." She held his gaze. "Is that wrong?" He shook his head. "No," he said. "That's exactly right." The courthouse that evening was fuller than Clara had expected. She felt them before she fully saw them. The weight of a room full of people turning toward the door when she came in with Nathaniel beside her, the quick ripple of whisper that went through the space before people caught themselves. She knew what it looked like, the two of them walking in together. She knew what people would make of it, and she had decided somewhere between the ranch and here that she did not particularly care. She had more important things to think about. Holloway was at the front of the room. He saw them come in, and something moved across his face, quickly controlled, but she caught it. He had not expected them. Good, she thought. Gerald was seated near the front, and he saw them too, and he did not manage his face as well as Holloway did. He looked for a moment genuinely frightened, which told Clara something important. It told her that whatever Gerald had agreed to do here tonight, he had agreed to do it believing she wouldn't be present to witness it. People made room for them. Not warmly, not in most cases, but they made room. Nathaniel nodded to several men near the back. The Henderson boys, she recognized them, and a heavy-set man she thought was Paulson from the South Valley. Webb had done his work. Dorothea Hale was in the third row. She looked at Clara with an expression that Clara filed away and did not respond to. Judge Harlan called the meeting to order. He was a small man with a large authority. The kind of judge who had been in a position long enough that the position had become invisible. You didn't see the office, you just saw the man. And the man had the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had decided long ago that most situations could be resolved by allowing them to fully arrive before responding. Holloway spoke first. He was good at it, Clara had to admit. He framed the water rights question in terms of the valley's long-term welfare. He talked about development, about the future of Montana Territory, about the importance of ensuring that resources were managed by people who understood their full value. He was careful not to say anything directly aggressive, which meant everything he said carried a kind of aggressive implication that was harder to argue against than a direct statement. People were listening. Some of them were nodding. Clara watched the room the way she watched a kitchen when something was developing that needed her attention. Not any single thing, but the whole of it, the temperature, the movement, where things were building and where they weren't. Then Holloway said, "I also want to raise a concern about the integrity of Carter Ranch operations, a concern that is relevant to this body because it speaks to the character of those making claims about water rights and land ownership in this valley." He nodded at Gerald. Gerald stood up. He had rehearsed this. Clara could tell by the way he moved, too deliberate, too careful, the movement of a man who has gone over the script enough times that the script has begun to replace the natural motion. He stated his name, his relationship to Harold. He said that Harold had incurred significant debts before his death. He said that Gerald had been left to settle those debts from the estate. He said that Harold's widow, he glanced at Clara, had left Kansas suddenly without settling her share of the obligations, and that questions remained about her knowledge of Harold's financial irregularities. He did not look at Clara while he said any of this. He looked at Judge Harlan. He looked at Holloway. He looked at the wall to the left of where Clara was standing. When he finished, the room was quiet. Clara felt the quality of that quiet. She felt people weighing it, deciding what to do with it, measuring it against what they already knew, or thought they knew, or thought they were supposed to think. Dorothea Hale said loudly enough to carry, "I always thought there was something—" "Mrs. Hale," said Nathaniel. She stopped. His voice had not been loud. It had been very quiet. But it carried in the way that quiet authority always carries when a room is already close to silence, and Dorothea Hale stopped speaking and pressed her lips together and looked forward. "Gerald Whitfield," Nathaniel said, turning to look directly at him. "I'd like you to answer a question." Holloway said, "This is not a—" "I'd like you to answer a question," Nathaniel repeated without inflection, without adjustment. He did not look at Holloway. He kept his eyes on Gerald. When Harold Whitfield died, what was the balance in his primary account at First Bank of Abilene? Gerald said nothing. I'll tell you what it was, Nathaniel said. According to records obtained by a lawyer named Breckenridge, who has been in correspondence with the bank in question for the past 2 weeks, the balance was $1,240, sufficient to cover every outstanding debt Harold had. He paused. After those debts were settled, Gerald, what was the remainder? Gerald's face was very still. There wasn't, he started. The remainder, Nathaniel said, was approximately $400, which Breckenridge has traced to an account in Lawrence, Kansas, opened in January of 1888. An account in your name. He let that sit, let it settle into the room like something heavy dropped onto a wooden floor. Harold Whitfield's money, in your account, while you were telling anyone who would listen that his estate was insolvent and his widow had abandoned her obligations. The room was not quiet anymore. Not loud exactly, but no longer quiet. The sound of a room full of people recalibrating something, adjusting a conclusion they'd been in the process of drawing. Gerald's face had gone past still into something that was almost gray. That's, he said, that's not. I have the bank records, Nathaniel said. Certified copies. I have them in this room tonight. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He produced an envelope. He held it up. He did not open it. He simply held it, and the sight of it in his hand, the physical presence of paper that represented truth in a room where someone had been attempting to use paper to represent lies, changed something in the atmosphere in a way that Clara felt in her chest. Holloway was very still. He was looking at the envelope, and Clara, watching him, saw the moment when a man who has built his operation on the assumption that certain things will never be looked at too carefully, realizes that someone has looked at them carefully. Judge Harlan, Nathaniel said, turning to the bench. I'd like to formally request that any proceedings related to Carter Ranch water rights or to the character of any employee of Carter Ranch be suspended until these documents can be reviewed. Judge Harlan looked at the envelope, looked at Holloway, looked at Gerald. He said, "That seems reasonable." His voice had the measured quality of a man being very precise about how much he was giving away. "Mr. Holloway, do you have anything to add?" Holloway looked at the room. He looked at Gerald. He looked at Nathaniel. He said, "I think we need to take some time to review these new developments." Which was, Clara understood, the most elegant form of retreat available to him. The meeting did not end dramatically. It ended the way things end when a plan collapses, but the people involved are too invested in maintaining appearances to acknowledge the collapse directly. People stood, conversations began. The room started to dissolve into smaller groups. But Clara felt it. She felt the shift in how people were looking at her. Not the curious measuring look that she had been receiving since the first Saturday at market. Something different. Something that wasn't quite apology and wasn't quite respect, but was somewhere between them, moving toward both. Mrs. Peterson from the vegetable stall worked her way through the crowd to stand beside Clara. "For what it's worth," Mrs. Peterson said quietly, "I never believed a word of it." "Thank you," Clara said. "The Henderson boys," Nathaniel said, appearing at her side, "want to talk to us before we leave. They've been watching Holloway's moves for longer than I have. They have information." He was standing very close to her. Not inappropriately close, just close in the way of someone who has decided that the appropriate distance between himself and this person is less than it used to be, and who is no longer bothering to perform the fiction that it isn't. "Then let's talk to them," Clara said. "The Henderson boys." Two men in their 40s, weathered and direct, the kind of men who measured everyone in the first 30 seconds and didn't revise much afterward, shook Nathaniel's hand, and then, to Clara's slight surprise, shook hers. "Your man Breckenridge," the older Henderson said. "He find anything else?" "Some," Nathaniel said. "Not everything. There are transactions we haven't traced yet." "There's a county clerk named Doherty," the younger Henderson said, "up in Cascade. We think Holloway got to him when he was taking the Mercer land. If Doherty helped file false paperwork, once he might have done it for others too." Nathaniel was listening with the complete, still attention that Clara had come to associate with him receiving something important. "If we can show a pattern," Nathaniel said slowly, "not just one fraudulent deal, but several." "Then it's not a land dispute," the older Henderson said. "It's a criminal matter." "And Gerald Whitfield," Clara said, keeping her voice low, speaking only to this small circle, "becomes a witness to Holloway's methods rather than a weapon against me." All three men looked at her. She had not meant to say it aloud exactly. It had been the thing she was working through in the back of her mind, and it had arrived at the surface faster than she'd managed. But it was right. She could see it in their faces. The older Henderson smiled, small and genuine. "She's sharp," he said to Nathaniel. "I'm aware," Nathaniel said. "She's standing right here," Clara said. The older Henderson laughed. It was a good laugh. It broke something in the tight atmosphere of the last hour, something that needed breaking. They stayed another 40 minutes. By the time they left the courthouse, they had the outlines of something that was not yet a plan, but was the beginning of one. Breckenridge to continue his work in Abilene, the Henderson boys to make contact with the families affected by Holloway's Cascade County dealings. Nathaniel to formally request a review of Doherty's county clerk records, and all of it to move quickly, because Holloway knew now that his leverage had collapsed, and a man without leverage was a man looking for a new approach. Outside, the night air was cool after the warmth of the packed courthouse. Clara stood on the steps and breathed it. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. "You did that," he said. "We did that," Clara said. "No," he said. "The records helped, but it was you. The way you stood there, the way you didn't flinch." He paused. "Half that room was ready to believe the worst about you when we walked in. By the end, half of them were looking at Gerald like he was the one who needed explaining. It's easier not to flinch," Clara said, "when you have someone standing beside you." A long quiet. The street below was mostly empty now, the meeting's crowd dispersing toward home. Nathaniel said, "Clara." "Yes." "I need to tell you something." She waited. "When I put up that advertisement," he said, "for a cook, I put it up because the hands were complaining about the food, and because someone told me I had to, and because it was the kind of problem I could solve practically, and I was very tired of problems I couldn't solve practically." He stopped, looked at his hands. "I told myself that's all it was, a practical problem with a practical solution." "I know," Clara said. "I was lying to myself," he said. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the street below, at the empty road and the darkness beyond it. And he had the expression of a man being honest with himself out loud, which is different from being honest in private, because it costs more and cannot be taken back. "This house hasn't felt like a home since Elizabeth died," he said. "I stopped wanting it to. Wanting things that can be taken from you, it felt like a mistake, like stupidity." He paused. "You came into that kitchen and you made it make sense again. And I kept telling myself it was just the cooking, that it was practical, that I was grateful the way an employer is grateful." He stopped again. Clara said nothing. She waited. "It isn't that," he said. The night was quiet around them. "Nathaniel," she said. "I know," he said quickly. I know it's not the right time, with Holloway still out there and everything unresolved, and I know." "That's not what I was going to say," Clara said. He looked at her. She met his eyes. "I was going to say," she said carefully, "that I came here because I had nothing left and nowhere to go, and that I intended to do my job and keep my distance and not—" She stopped. "I intended not to let this become anything that could be taken from me." "And now," he said. She looked at him for a long moment in the cool dark outside the courthouse, where they had just fought something together that neither of them could have fought alone. "Now," she said, "I think some things are worth the risk of losing." The silence between them was not the empty kind. It was the full kind, the kind you want to stay in for a while. From the wagon, Pete Garner's voice carried through the dark with the complete absence of subtlety that was Pete's defining characteristic. You two about ready. Some of us are old and the nights get cold. Clara pressed her lips together. Nathaniel ducked his head, and they walked down the steps together toward the wagon, and neither of them was quite smiling, and both of them were, and the night was large and dark and full of unfinished things. But for the first time the unfinished things felt like reasons to stay, not reasons to leave. The morning after the courthouse, Clara woke before the sun. She lay in her narrow bed in the room off the kitchen and listened to the ranch settling into its early sounds. The horses in the paddock, the wind moving through the grass, the first birds somewhere distant doing what birds do before the world is fully awake, and she thought about what Nathaniel had said on those courthouse steps. Some things are worth the risk of losing. She had said it. She had meant it. And now, in the particular honesty of early morning, when the night's courage has faded and the day's reality has not yet fully formed, she sat with both of those facts and tried to decide if she was frightened. She was, but it was a different kind of frightened than the kind she was accustomed to. Not the frightened of a woman with nothing and nowhere to go. Not the frightened of someone standing in her own doorway watching everything be taken from her. This was smaller and more personal, and somehow in its smallness more terrifying. It was the frightened of someone who had something to lose again. She got up. She made coffee. She started breakfast. Nathaniel came downstairs at 5:30, which was earlier than usual, and she understood without either of them saying, so that he had slept approximately as well as she had. He poured his coffee and stood at the kitchen counter and looked at her with an expression that was careful and open in equal measure, the expression of a man who had said something real the night before and was now in the honest light of morning, determining whether he regretted it. He didn't look like he regretted it. "Breckenridge is sending the full documentation by courier," he said. "Should arrive by Thursday." "Good," Clara said. "Henderson's older boy rode out this morning before dawn," he said. "He's going up to Cascade County personally. Wants to talk to some of the families Holloway dealt with before." "How long will that take?" Clara asked. 4 days, maybe 5, Nathaniel said. "If he finds what we think he'll find." "Then we have enough," Clara said. "Then we have enough," Nathaniel agreed. They looked at each other across the kitchen. "In the meantime," Clara said, turning back to the stove, "your men need breakfast." "They do," Nathaniel said. "And Holloway needs to believe," she said carefully, "that last night rattled us more than it did, that we're on the defensive, that we're not ready." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "You think like a strategist," he said. "I think like someone who has spent her whole life," Clara said, "being underestimated by people who thought they had more power than they did. It teaches you things." Nathaniel set down his coffee cup. He crossed the kitchen. He came to stand beside her at the stove close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he said quietly, "When this is over." "When it's over," she said, not looking up from the pan. "Yes," he said. A beat. "All right," she said. And that was enough. That was everything it needed to be right at this moment, the acknowledgement that there was a when, that there was an after, that both of them intended to be in it together. The rest could wait for the right moment, and neither of them was a person who confused urgency with readiness. He went back to his coffee. She finished the eggs. Outside, the sun came up over the Montana mountains, in the slow, enormous way that the sun comes up over open country, like it has all the time in the world and intends to use it, and Carter Ranch woke up around them, and the day began. The waiting was the hardest part. Clara had always been bad at waiting. She was a person of motion, of action, of doing the next thing, and the 4 days between the courthouse and the arrival of Breckenridge's courier were the kind of days where motion was a discipline rather than a natural state. There was work to do. Always the ranch's appetite was relentless and reliable, but underneath the work there was the low constant tension of something unresolved, something moving toward them that they couldn't see clearly yet. Holloway was quiet. That was the unsettling thing. After the courthouse, after the collapse of Gerald's testimony, after the very public failure of his first approach, Clara had expected movement, retaliation, a new angle. But the days passed and nothing came, and the silence from Holloway's direction had the quality not of retreat, but of preparation. Webb reported from town each morning. Nothing unusual at the courthouse. Holloway's men seen around but doing nothing overt. Gerald Whitfield had taken a room at the boarding house and had not been seen at the saloon or the general store, or anywhere a person with nothing to hide tends to be seen. "He's still here," Tommy said on the third day with the tone of a young man who finds this deeply suspicious. "Why's he still here if his plan didn't work?" "Because Holloway hasn't released him yet," Clara said. "Gerald doesn't do anything without being told to. He never did." Tommy looked at her. "You don't seem scared," he said. "I'm scared," Clara said. "I'm just not going to let that be the most interesting thing about me." Tommy thought about this for a moment. "That's real smart, Miss Clara," he said. "Thank you, Tommy. My mother used to say something like that." "Your mother," Clara said, "sounds like a very wise woman." "Yes, ma'am," Tommy said. "She was." On the fourth day, Breckenridge's courier arrived. The man was young, dust-covered, and had the slightly dazed quality of someone who had been riding hard for 2 days. Clara fed him before Nathaniel took him to the study, which she considered correct priorities, and Nathaniel did not argue with. She waited. She made herself wait in the kitchen, while Nathaniel and the courier were in the study with the door closed. She made bread that didn't need making yet, and watched the hallway, and told herself that pacing would not make the door open faster. When the study door finally opened, and she heard Nathaniel's footsteps in the hall, she turned from the work table and tried to read his face before he spoke. His face gave her the answer before his mouth did. "Breckenridge found all of it," he said. Clara gripped the edge of the work table. "All of it," she said. "Gerald took $600 from Harold's estate," Nathaniel said. He was controlled, but she could hear what was underneath it. The particular tightness of a man who is very angry on behalf of someone else, which is a different quality of anger than personal anger, and in some ways, more intense. "And there's more. Holloway's name appears in documents connected to the Mercer deal. Not directly, he used a proxy, a lawyer named Ashford out of Billings, but the paper trail connects them. Doherty, the county clerk, signed a land transfer that used falsified boundary markers." He paused. "And Breckenridge found 2 other families in Kansas with the same pattern as Harold's estate. The same approach. The same missing money. The same story told about the widow." Clara went very still. "The same story," she said. "Gerald has done this before," Nathaniel said. This was not the first time he found a grieving woman with a dead husband's accounts and used the accounts to Clara. She had turned away from him. She was standing with her hands flat on the work table and her back to him, and she was doing the thing she always did when something struck deeper than she had prepared for. She was breathing steadily, deliberately, willing herself not to show the full weight of it. Because this was not just about her. There were other women, other Claras, somewhere in Kansas, who had stood in their own doorways and watched Gerald Whitfield walk away with their husbands' money and their husbands' names. Other women who had been made to feel that they were the problem, that they were the shameful thing, that the decent thing to do was go quietly and not make a fuss. She turned around. Her eyes were bright, but her voice was steady. "We need to send word to those families," she said. Nathaniel looked at her. "We will," he said. "Breckenridge is already on it." He took a step toward her. "Are you all right?" "No," she said honestly. "But I will be. After." "After." He agreed. He reached out. His hand closed over hers on the edge of the work table, not dramatically, not with declaration, just firmly and completely, the gesture of someone reminding another person that they are not standing alone. Clara looked down at his hand. She turned hers over and held it. "Wednesday," Nathaniel said. "We take this to Judge Harlan on Wednesday. I'm not waiting any longer." "Wednesday." Clara agreed. She let go of his hand. She went back to the bread. But the kitchen felt different for the rest of the afternoon, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so, because some things don't need saying. Tuesday evening, Gerald Whitfield knocked on the door of Carter Ranch, alone, without Holloway. Clara opened the door because she happened to be crossing the hallway when the knock came, and she opened it before she had time to consider whether someone else should. Gerald stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, and his face doing something she had never seen it do before. He looked ashamed. Not defensive ashamed, not caught and making the best of it ashamed. Actually genuinely ashamed, the way a person looks when they have spent several sleepless nights arriving at a conclusion they did not want to arrive at. "Clara," he said. "Gerald," she said. "I need to speak with you," he said, "and with Carter, if he's willing." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about every reason she had to close the door. She thought about what Harold would have done. "Come in," she said. She brought him to the kitchen, which was deliberate, because the kitchen was her territory, and she was not going to give Gerald Whitfield the advantage of any ground he might consider his own. She made him sit at the table. She put coffee in front of him without asking if he wanted it. She stood at the work table and folded her arms and waited. Nathaniel came in 2 minutes later, having been told by Tommy that there was a development, and his eyes went from Gerald to Clara to the door and back to Gerald with the rapid assessment of a man checking for threats. "He came alone," Clara said. Nathaniel pulled out a chair. He sat down across from Gerald. He did not pour himself coffee. He simply looked at Gerald with the particular quality of patience that is not comfortable for the person being waited on. Gerald wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. He didn't drink from it. "Holloway is going to file the land claim Wednesday morning," he said, "before you can get to Harlan. He found out someone told him you have the documents from Breckenridge. He's moving the timeline up." "How do you know this?" Nathaniel said. "Because I was there when he decided it," Gerald said. "I've been in his pocket since Billings. He reached out to me 3 months ago, said he needed someone who knew Clara who could speak to Harold's. He said I'd be paid. He said it would be quick and clean and nobody would be hurt." "You thought destroying my name was quick and clean," Clara said. Her voice was even. Gerald flinched. "I thought—" He stopped. "I told myself you'd just move on, the way you always do, that you were strong enough to. I told myself it wasn't really hurting you because you'd recover." He looked at the table. "That was a lie I told myself because the money was real and your hurt was easier to make abstract." The kitchen was very quiet. "But then Breckenridge started pulling at the accounts," Gerald said. "And I realized it wasn't just going to be the reputation. If Holloway files Wednesday and Harlan doesn't have time to review the documents first, then even if the whole thing falls apart, eventually the land claim creates a legal freeze on Carter Ranch's water rights. Could take months to resolve, maybe a year. And during that year, Nathaniel said, I can't make a deal with anyone else. Can't sell, can't develop, can't bring in partners. The ranch runs on credit that depends on clean title." He paused. "He doesn't need to win. He just needs to tie me up long enough that I run out of options, and he becomes the path of least resistance." "Yes," Gerald said. "And you're telling me this now?" Nathaniel said, "Because." Gerald looked at Clara. Not at Nathaniel, at Clara. "Because I knew Harold," he said. "I told myself I didn't anymore. Told myself he made his choices and I made mine, and we'd grown apart. But the truth is, Harold was the best person in our family. He was the one who—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "When our father was sick, Harold was the one who stayed. I left. I said I had business. I said I'd come back, and I didn't, and Harold stayed and handled everything and never once said a word against me for it." He looked at the table again. "And I repaid that by stealing from his widow. I told myself I was owed it. I told myself a lot of things." He picked up the coffee cup, put it down without drinking. "I can't fix what I took, but I can tell you what I know, and I can tell it in front of Judge Harlan tomorrow morning if that helps." The silence in the kitchen held. Clara looked at her brother-in-law. She looked at the man who had stood at Harold's funeral and told her she didn't belong there, who had taken the last of what Harold had worked for, who had crossed state lines to help a stranger take what little she had built since. She thought about forgiveness. Not the easy kind. She was not in the business of the easy kind. But the practical kind, the kind that is less about the other person and more about what you're willing to carry. The kind that Harold would have understood, because Harold had always understood that carrying bitterness was an exhausting business that cost the carrier more than the person being carried against. "Tell Judge Harlan everything," she said. "Not for me, for the other women. The ones in Kansas." Gerald looked up. "There are others," Nathaniel said. "Your pattern with Harold's estate wasn't the first time. Breckenridge has found 2 others. Women who lost their husbands' money the same way." Gerald went pale. "I didn't know about others," he said. "You didn't ask," Clara said. "That's the difference between not knowing and not wanting to know." Gerald put his face in his hands. He sat that way for a moment. Then he took his hands away and straightened in his chair and looked at Nathaniel with the expression of a man who has arrived at a point past which there is nothing left to protect. "Tell me what you need from me," he said. "I'll do it." They were at the courthouse by 7 the next morning. Judge Harlan arrived at 7:15 and found them waiting outside his door. Nathaniel, Clara, Gerald, the Henderson brothers. Webb, and somewhat unexpectedly old Pete Garner, who had told Tommy he was coming, and that Tommy could tell the boss or not as he saw fit, and either way, Pete was coming. Harlan looked at the group. He looked at Gerald. He looked at Nathaniel. "I have a feeling," Harlan said, "that I am going to need more coffee than usual this morning." "You are," Nathaniel agreed. They went inside. Gerald told his account first. He told it without embellishment and without deflection, which Clara suspected was partly the effect of having made his decision the night before, and partly the effect of being in a room with people who already knew enough that lying would only create additional problems. He told it plainly, the way a man tells a hard thing when he has decided the telling is the right thing to do, and he wants to get through it cleanly. Harlan listened. He asked 4 questions. He took notes. Then Nathaniel presented Breckenridge's documents. The bank records the account, traces the connection between Ashford and Holloway and Doherty, the boundary survey irregularities from the Mercer deal. He laid it out with the methodical precision of someone who had been preparing this for days, which he had, and Clara watched Judge Harlan's face as each piece arrived and saw the face of a man who had been in this county long enough to have seen men like Holloway before, and who was quietly furious that he had not seen this one sooner. The Henderson brothers confirmed the Cascade County connections from their own knowledge. They named names, dates, properties. When Nathaniel finished, the room was very still. Harlan looked at all of them. He looked at Clara last. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "is there anything you'd like to add?" She had not been expecting to speak. She had spent the morning letting the evidence speak for itself, which she considered correct. Evidence was harder to dismiss than a woman's word, and she was not interested in giving Holloway or anyone else the opportunity to frame this as a personal grievance rather than a documented fraud. But Harlan had asked. She stood up. "I came to Montana Territory," she said, "because I had nothing left and I needed work. I came to Carter Ranch because a man offered fair wages and didn't ask me to be anything other than competent." She kept her voice steady and her eyes on Harlan. "I am asking this court to look at the evidence in front of it. Not at me. Not at my size or my situation or the fact that I am a widow with no family and no long history in this county. At the evidence. Because the evidence will tell you everything you need to know about who is honest in this room and who is not." Harlan held her gaze for a moment. "Well said," he said quietly. He turned back to his papers. He signed the order suspending Holloway's land claim filing before 9 o'clock. He issued a summons for Richard Holloway to appear before him that afternoon. He forwarded the evidence regarding Gerald Whitfield and the Kansas estates to the Territorial Marshal's office with a recommendation for further investigation, and he looked at Dorothea Hale, who had somehow materialized in the back of the room in the way that Dorothea Hale always materialized wherever important things were happening, and he said mildly, "I trust this will be reflected in the conversations of this community going forward." Dorothea Hale straightened her back. "Of course," she said in the tone of a woman renegotiating a position she would never openly admit to having held. Clara did not look at her. She was looking at the window, at the morning light coming through it, at the very ordinary, very beautiful sight of a Wednesday in July in Montana Territory, the world going on outside the courthouse with complete indifference to the fact that something important had just happened inside it. She felt Nathaniel come to stand beside her. She didn't turn. "It's done," he said. "Almost," she said. "Almost," he agreed. "Holloway still has to answer to Harlan this afternoon." "He'll answer," Clara said. "Men like that always think they can talk their way out of a room." "He'll try." She paused. "He'll find out Harlan doesn't work that way." Nathaniel glanced at her. "You're not worried," he said. "I'm tired," she said. "That's different." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Pete wants to take everyone to the hotel dining room for breakfast. He says he hasn't had hotel eggs since 1882, and someone owes him." Clara turned from the window. "Someone owes him. He says he's been the most helpful ranch hand in the history of the territory and has been consistently underappreciated." Clara laughed. It felt good. It felt clean in her chest, the way laughing feels when it comes after something hard, when the body is releasing something it was holding, and relief and humor arrive at the same moment and can't be distinguished from each other. "He's not wrong," she said. "About the underappreciated part." They had breakfast. Hotel eggs and fresh bread and coffee that was Pete declared acceptable, which from Pete was the culinary equivalent of a standing ovation. The Henderson brothers ate without speaking, which was how they always ate. And Webb told a long story about a land dispute he'd witnessed in Wyoming that bore absolutely no resemblance to what they had just gone through, and was somehow completely appropriate to the mood. Tommy Briggs ate 3 plates of eggs and looked at Clara periodically, with the expression of a young man who had decided that the person sitting across from him was the finest human being he had personally encountered, and who was slightly overwhelmed by this feeling, but had decided to express it through egg consumption rather than direct statement. Clara watched them, She watched all of them, her ranch hands, her rowdy and loyal and imperfect collection of men who had stood without being asked in the yard when Holloway came, who had driven to the courthouse Tuesday evening with their hats in their hands and their intentions clear, who had eaten her cooking for 8 weeks and become without her planning for it, something that felt uncomfortably and wonderfully like family. She thought, "I did not expect this." She thought, "I did not expect any of this." She thought, "This is the thing about walking 6 miles with a suitcase and knocking on a stranger's door. You cannot know what is behind it. You can only knock." Richard Holloway appeared before Judge Harlan at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Clara and Nathaniel were there. Holloway arrived with the lawyer. A different lawyer, not Ashford, a man from Helena who had clearly been reached by urgent telegram that morning, and who had the slightly off-balance quality of someone who has not had enough time to prepare and knows it. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. Harlan was precise and without theater. He laid out what the evidence showed. He asked Holloway to explain specific documents. Holloway's lawyer objected twice. Harlan overruled twice with the same mild, absolute certainty with which he had done everything else. When it was done, Holloway's land claim was formally rejected. His methods in Cascade County were referred to the Territorial Attorney's Office. His connection to Ashford and Dougherty was placed in the official record. He was not arrested. The law in 1889 moved at its own pace and required its own processes, but he was finished in this valley. Clara knew it in the way she knew things, not through dramatic announcement, but through the quality of the room when the last word was said. The particular silence of something that has run its course. Holloway walked past her on his way out. He stopped. He looked at her. He said nothing. She looked back. She said nothing either. There was nothing to say. He had underestimated her in the specific, expensive way that people underestimate someone when they look at what they can see and decide it tells them everything there is to know. He had seen a widow without connections, without money, without the conventional armor of a powerful name or a powerful family, and he had decided she was the easiest lever he could use. He had not considered what a woman who had already survived losing everything might be willing to do when she decided she was done surviving and ready to fight. He walked out. Clara let out a breath she had been holding for 11 days. Nathaniel's hand found the small of her back, Brief light there, and then gone the gesture of a man who is being careful about where he is and who is watching and what is appropriate, but who cannot entirely contain the impulse to reach toward the person standing beside him. She felt it. She didn't react to it, not in front of the room, not with Harlan still at the bench and the Henderson brothers standing nearby. But she felt it, and she was glad. The weeks that followed were not quiet exactly, but they were a different quality of loud. The noise of things being resolved rather than the noise of things falling apart. Breckenridge's investigation into the Kansas estates moved forward. 2 other families were identified, their cases documented, their losses at last having a shape and a name attached to them. Gerald Whitfield cooperated with the marshal's office with the thoroughness of a man trying to make a debt good that he knows can never be fully paid. Clara received a letter from one of the Kansas women, a widow named Jessie in Topeka, who wrote that she had not believed anyone would ever look into what had happened to her, and that she had cried for an hour when the marshal came to her door. Clara cried a little too reading that letter. She let herself. She was getting better at letting herself. Dorothea Hale came to the ranch on a Friday morning in August. Clara saw the wagon from the kitchen window and had exactly 1 second of the old feeling, the brace, the preparation for whatever version of judgment was about to arrive, before she straightened her spine and untied her apron and went to the front door. Dorothea Hale stood on the porch with a covered dish in her hands. She looked at Clara. Clara looked at her. "I brought a pie," Dorothea said. She said it with the particular stiffness of a woman who is doing something she has decided is right and is not entirely comfortable with the decision. "Apple. I heard it's your preference at Carter Ranch." Clara looked at the pie. She looked at Dorothea Hale. "Come in," Clara said. "I'll make coffee." They sat at the kitchen table for 45 minutes. Dorothea did not apologize directly because Dorothea Hale was constitutionally incapable of a direct apology, but she said a number of things that amounted to an apology if you arranged them correctly, and Clara had spent enough years listening to what people meant rather than what they said to hear it. When Dorothea left, she pressed Clara's hand at the door with a brief, slightly awkward firmness and said, "You're not what I expected." "No," Clara agreed. "I usually am not." After she was gone, Clara cut a piece of the apple pie and ate it at the kitchen table. It was good. Not as good as Clara's, but genuinely good. She thought that Dorothea Hale, underneath the posturing and the performance of social authority, was probably a woman who had also spent her life deciding what she was allowed to show the world and what she had to keep hidden. She thought that most women probably were in one way or another. She thought about Tommy's mother in Tennessee, about Jessie in Topeka, about her friend Ruth in Abilene, who wrote letters when she knew where to send them, who had written just last week to say that she was glad Clara had found somewhere that she had known Clara would find somewhere, that she had never doubted it, even when Clara had. She thought about Harold, who had laughed at a church social when she said something honest and had not stopped loving her for her honesty for the duration of his life. She thought about Nathaniel, who had stepped back from a door and said, "Come in," and had meant it in every way that a person can mean 2 words. She was still at the table with the pie and her thoughts when she heard his boots on the kitchen steps. He came in and saw the pie and looked at her. "Dorothea Hale," Clara said. "Good Lord," he said. "It's actually quite good," Clara said. He sat down across from her. She cut him a piece without asking. He ate it. Outside, the August afternoon was doing what August afternoons do in Montana, going golden in the particular way of summer light that knows it has limited time and intends to make use of it. "I want to ask you something," Nathaniel said. Clara folded her hands on the table. "Ask," she said. "This started as a job," he said. "Cook for the ranch. Wages and board." "It did," Clara said. "I would like," he said carefully with the deliberateness of a man who has thought about something for a long time and is now doing the thinking out loud because the time has arrived for it to be something else. Clara looked at him. He was looking back at her with the complete, undefended directness that was so thoroughly Nathaniel Carter. No performance, no calculation. Just the thing itself offered plainly to the person he was offering it to. "I would like," he said, "for you to stay. Not as the cook. not in any capacity that comes with a wage and a room off the kitchen." He paused. "I would like you to stay as someone who belongs here. Because you do belong here. You belonged here from the moment you walked through that door, and I knew it before I was ready to say it. And I have been ready for several weeks now, and I wanted to wait until everything else was settled, so that this didn't get tangled up in all the rest of it." Clara breathed. In, out. "Nathaniel," she said. "I know what you're going to say," he said. "Do you?" she said. "You're going to say, it's fast," he said. "You're going to say you don't want to make a decision when you've just come through something hard. You're going to say you need time." She thought about this. "I was going to say," she said slowly, "that the room off the kitchen has a draft in winter. I noticed it the first cold night. The window doesn't seal properly." Nathaniel stared at her. "There are better rooms in this house," she said. "Warmer rooms. Rooms that look east for the morning light." She held his gaze. "I've been thinking about that for a while." The kitchen was entirely quiet. Then Nathaniel Carter, who had been closed for 5 years, who had built walls from grief and loss, and the particular stubbornness of a man who believed that protecting himself was the same thing as surviving, leaned forward across the table and took both of Clara's hands in his. She let him. "You are the most unexpected person," he said quietly, "that I have ever let through a door." "You are the first person in a long time," she said, "who opened one." He stood up. He came around the table. He reached down and she stood, and they were very close in the afternoon light of that kitchen that had been cold for 5 years and was not cold anymore. "Clara Whitfield," he said. "Nathaniel Carter," she said. And he kissed her, gently, completely, with the particular tenderness of two people who have each been broken before and know the value of being careful with something fragile, and the particular courage of two people who have decided that fragile does not mean impossible. Outside the ranch went on being the ranch. Tommy Briggs was almost certainly somewhere nearby, being 19 and noticing things he wasn't supposed to notice. Old Pete Garner was almost certainly expressing opinions to no one in particular. The horses were in the paddock. The kitchen had coffee on the stove. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. They were married in September, beneath the old oak tree, at the edge of the north pasture, with the mountains behind them, and the whole of Carter Ranch spread out in the golden light of early autumn. The Henderson brothers came. Mrs. Peterson came with vegetables and tears. Tommy Briggs wore his best shirt and still managed to get a stain on it before the ceremony ended, which was the most Tommy Briggs thing that had ever happened. And Clara laughed until her eyes watered. Pete Garner cried. He denied this afterward, and the official position of everyone present was that something had gotten in his eye, and nobody disputed it to his face because they all knew better. Ruth came from Abilene. She arrived 2 days before the wedding and walked into the Carter Ranch kitchen and looked at it and looked at Clara and said, "Well, I told you." "You told me nothing of the kind," Clara said. "I told you in my heart," Ruth said. "That counts." Clara held her friend and breathed in the familiar smell of her dust and rosewater, and something that was simply Ruth, simply home, simply the proof that some things persist through distance and time and changed addresses. "I'm happy," Clara said. Ruth held her tighter. "I know," she said. "I know." The years that followed were not perfect because nothing is, and Clara Whitfield had never been a woman who mistook perfection for happiness. There were hard winters and difficult seasons, and the ordinary erosions and restorations of a life shared between two people who are both in their own ways stubborn and particular, and deeply committed to their own views of the correct way to do things. They argued about the kitchen. Always. The kitchen always about budget or ingredients, or whether 28 men really needed dessert on a Tuesday, which was a discussion that never resolved itself, and became over time something they both engaged in with a kind of comfortable ritual investment that had long since ceased to be about the actual question. They argued about the north pasture and the water allocation, and once memorably about whether a particular horse had the disposition for ranch work or the disposition for being a problem. And Nathaniel was right about the horse, and Clara made him admit it directly, and they were both quietly delighted by this. They built things together. Not just the ranch, though. The ranch grew. The water rights secured the land, expanded carefully. The Carter name attached to a reputation for honest dealing that held through changing times and changing administrations, and the long, complicated business of Montana Territory becoming a state. They built a table that was never empty, a house that was never silent, a kitchen that smelled of bread and coffee, and the particular warmth of a place that is loved by the people inside it. Jessie from Topeka came to visit one summer 2 years after the letters had started, and stayed 3 weeks and left with a color in her face that she hadn't had when she arrived, and wrote afterward that she thought she might be ready to try again. Try at life. Try at happiness. Try at the terrifying business of deciding that what had been taken from you was not the last of what you had. Clara wrote back and said yes. Yes, she said. Try. Because the thing she had learned, the hard, real, irreducible thing that had cost her years and miles, and a suitcase and 6 miles of summer road, and a door she had not known she had the right to knock on, was this: you do not find your way back to life by waiting for someone to carry you. You find it by picking up whatever you have left, by walking as far as it takes, by knocking, and by having the courage when the door opens to walk through it. Clara Carter had walked through it, and on the other side had been everything she had stopped believing she deserved: warmth and belonging, and a man who looked at her not with the eyes of the world that had always found her wanting, but with the eyes of someone who had needed her and been changed by her, and would spend the rest of his life glad she had knocked. She was not small. She was not invisible. She was not the woman people whispered about in Willow Creek, not the widow nobody vouched for, not the cook hired out of desperation and kept out of convenience. She was Clara Carter. She was the heart of this house, and she had earned every room in it.